Every mother's heart breaks a little when she watches her sons grow up without their father's guiding hand. Eleanor Wade knew that pain all too well as she watched her two boys struggle to find their way in the harsh world of the frontier. When her husband died, Eleanor inherited more than just his ranch. She inherited every predator who saw a vulnerable widow as easy prey. The suitors came with false smiles and hungry eyes, wanting her land more than her heart. Then Cade Mercer rode into Prairie Gulch, 6'4" of weathered cowboy with hands that had seen too much violence and eyes that held too many secrets. Most women would have been afraid. Eleanor saw something different, a man who could teach her sons what she couldn't. His offer was simple and shocking. Teach my boys to be men, and I'll be your wife. She never expected to hear those words from a stranger. But when a ruthless cattle baron threatens everything she holds dear, will Cade's deadly past be enough to protect the family they're building together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Wade stood before the massive oak-framed portrait hanging in her parlor, studying the painted face of her late husband with a mixture of love and desperate longing. Henry Wade gazed back from the canvas with those gentle brown eyes that had first captured her heart 12 years ago, his strong jaw set with the quiet confidence that had made her feel so safe. The artist had captured every detail perfectly, the slight crow's feet from years of smiling, the way his dark hair fell just slightly over his forehead, even the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. 2 years had passed since consumption took Henry from her, yet some mornings Eleanor still woke expecting to find him beside her, still caught herself setting 2 cups for coffee before remembering she was alone. The portrait was both comfort and torment, a daily reminder of what she'd lost and could never reclaim. "Mama!" Thomas broke the fence gate again. Michael's voice carried from the kitchen, sharp with the authority of his 14 years and the frustration of being the eldest. Eleanor sighed and turned away from Henry's painted smile, smoothing her hands over her simple blue dress, one of the few that didn't carry memories of wearing it for him. She found her younger son, 12-year-old Thomas, standing defiantly in the kitchen doorway with mud caked on his boots and guilt written across his freckled face. His red hair, so like hers, stood at wild angles, and his green eyes, Henry's eyes, blazed with the stubborn pride that got him into trouble daily. "It wasn't my fault," Thomas declared before Eleanor could speak. "The gate was already loose, and when I tried to move the horses—" "You weren't supposed to be in the corral alone," Michael interrupted, crossing his arms with an air of superiority that made him look older than his years. Where Thomas was fire and impulse, Michael was steadiness and consideration, though lately that steadiness had hardened into premature responsibility. "Papa always said, 'Papa's dead!'" The words tore from Thomas's throat with such raw pain that Eleanor's breath caught. "He's been dead for 2 years, and you're not him, so stop pretending you are." The silence that followed was devastating. Michael's face went white, then red, his hands clenching into fists. Eleanor watched her sons, her babies who had grown too hard, too fast, and felt the familiar weight of failure settle on her shoulders. She was raising them wrong. Every choice felt like a mistake. Every day brought new evidence of how desperately they needed what she couldn't give them. "Thomas, apologize to your brother," she said quietly, though her heart was breaking for both of them. "Michael, help me assess the damage to the gate." But Thomas was already gone, his boots thundering up the wooden stairs to his room, leaving Eleanor and Michael standing in the aftermath of words that couldn't be taken back. "Mama," Michael said softly, and in that single word she heard all his worry, all his attempts to be the man of the house when he was still just a boy. "I'm sorry. I know I'm not Papa, but somebody has to." "Oh, sweetheart." Eleanor pulled him into her arms, though he was nearly as tall as she was now. "You don't have to be anything but my son. That's enough. That's more than enough." But they both knew it wasn't true. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat on the front porch of the ranch house that had been Henry's pride, watching the sun paint the rolling hills of Prairie Gulch in shades of gold and amber. The Wade Ranch sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, blessed with clear streams and natural windbreaks that made it one of the most valuable properties in the territory. Henry had spent his life building something lasting, something he could pass to his sons. Now Eleanor struggled just to keep it running. The sound of hooves on the dusty road made her look up, though she already knew what she'd see. Another suitor, no doubt, drawn by word of her situation, like vultures to carrion. They came regularly, now men who spoke of her beauty and loneliness, while their eyes calculated the worth of her land. She'd grown skilled at reading their intentions in the first 5 minutes of conversation. This one rode a fine bay horse and wore clothes too clean for honest ranch work. As he dismounted and approached the porch, Eleanor noted his soft hands and the way he carried himself like a man, accustomed to having others do the difficult work. "Mrs. Wade, what a pleasure to see you again." Theodore Hutchins swept off his hat with an elaborate bow that might have been charming if it weren't so practiced. "You look lovely today, though I detect a certain melancholy in your expression. Perhaps what you need is companionship, someone to share the burdens of this magnificent property." Eleanor managed a polite smile. "Mr. Hutchins, I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing quite well. Are you?" His eyes swept over the ranch with proprietorial interest. "I couldn't help but notice several of your fence lines need repair, and word around town is that you've lost 2 more ranch hands this month. A woman alone simply cannot maintain an operation of this size." The patronizing tone grated against Eleanor's nerves like sandpaper. "My husband ran this ranch with 3 hands and seasonal help. I see no reason why I cannot do the same." "Your husband was a man, my dear." Hutchins moved closer, his smile becoming more predatory. He understood cattle, land management, the complexities of dealing with suppliers and buyers. These are not matters for the feminine mind to grasp. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her coffee cup. "I've been managing the books and correspondence for this ranch since before my husband's death. Mr. Hutchins, the feminine mind seems quite capable of grasping profit and loss." Of course. He waved a dismissive hand. "But there are other considerations. Your sons, for instance, growing boys, need a father's firm guidance. Without proper masculine influence, well," he glanced toward the broken gate that Thomas had damaged. "I'm sure you've noticed the signs of their running wild." Heat flared in Eleanor's chest. "My sons are good boys, dealing with grief in their own way." "Indeed, and that's precisely why you need a husband, someone to take charge, to discipline them properly. I've given this matter considerable thought. Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? And I believe we could make an excellent partnership. Your land, combined with my business connections and capital, would create quite an empire. As for your boys, well, military school would sort them out in short order." Eleanor stood abruptly. "Military school? Certainly. It's the best solution for boys who've been allowed to run wild. A year or 2 of proper discipline, and they'll return as young gentlemen ready to serve in whatever capacity their new father deems appropriate." The casual way he spoke of shipping her sons away, of erasing Henry from their lives and hearts, sent fury coursing through Eleanor's veins. "Mr. Hutchins, I believe our conversation is over. Now, Eleanor, don't be hasty. I understand maternal attachment, but you must consider what's best for everyone involved. I'm prepared to be quite generous in our arrangement. You'd want for nothing, and the boys would receive excellent educations. Away from their home, away from their father's memory, away from me. Temporarily, of course. Character building requires sacrifice." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Mr. Hutchins, I'll give you the same answer I've given every man who's come here with similar proposals. I'm not interested in a business arrangement disguised as marriage. I'm not interested in sending my sons away to be reformed by strangers. And I'm certainly not interested in a man who sees my family as obstacles to be managed, rather than people to be cherished." His practiced charm slipped, revealing the calculating coldness beneath. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor. This ranch is too much for a woman alone. Eventually, you'll fail, and when you do, you'll have no choice but to sell. The question is whether you'll have anything left to negotiate with, or whether you'll be forced to accept whatever offer comes your way." "That sounds almost like a threat, Mr. Hutchins." "Merely an observation based on economic reality." He replaced his hat and mounted his horse with less grace than he'd dismounted. "When you come to your senses, you know where to find me. But don't wait too long. My patience, like my offer, has limits." Eleanor watched him ride away, her hands trembling with suppressed rage and fear. Because as much as she hated to admit it, he wasn't entirely wrong about her challenges. The ranch hands had quit when she couldn't match the wages offered by larger operations. The repairs were piling up faster than she could manage them, and her sons, her precious boys, were struggling in ways she didn't know how to address. That evening, after a mostly silent dinner where Thomas pushed his food around his plate and Michael made polite conversation that felt forced, Eleanor tucked Thomas into bed despite his protests that he was too old for such treatment. "Mama," he said quietly as she smoothed his hair, "are you going to marry one of those men who keep coming around?" Eleanor's heart clenched. "What makes you ask that? I heard what Mr. Hutchins said about military school. And Jimmy Morrison at school says his pa thinks you'll have to marry somebody soon or lose the ranch." Thomas's green eyes were wide with worry in the lamplight. "I don't want to go away to school, Mama. I want to stay here with you and Michael and Papa's memory." Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed, choosing her words carefully. "Thomas, I promise you that I will never send you and Michael away unless you want to go. This is your home, your father's legacy. No one will take that from you." "But what if you can't keep the ranch? What if we lose Papa's house and his land and everything?" The question she'd been avoiding echoed in the darkness of her son's bedroom. What if she couldn't hold on to Henry's dream? What if her stubborn independence cost her boys their inheritance? "Then we'll face that together, as a family," she said finally. "But I'm not giving up yet. Your Papa built something strong here, and I intend to honor that." Thomas nodded solemnly, then surprised her by throwing his arms around her neck. "I love you, Mama. Even when I'm angry and say mean things, I love you." Eleanor held him tight, breathing in the scent of hay and childhood that still clung to him despite his efforts to seem grown up. "I love you too, sweetheart. Always." Later, after checking on Michael, who pretended to be asleep but wasn't, Eleanor returned to the parlor and Henry's portrait. The house creaked around her with familiar sounds, but tonight the loneliness felt heavier than usual. She poured herself a small glass of Henry's whiskey, a ritual she'd developed for the hardest nights, and settled into his favorite chair. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to the painted face. "The boys need something I can't give them. But every man who comes here sees us as a problem to be solved, rather than a family to be loved. I'm failing them, Henry. I'm failing you." The portrait offered no answers, just Henry's eternal, gentle smile. But as Eleanor sat in the darkness, sipping whiskey and fighting tears, she found herself thinking about what kind of man could love her sons, not despite their wildness and grief, but because of their passionate hearts. What kind of man could see strength in a widow's determination rather than weakness in her struggles? Such a man probably didn't exist, she told herself. But as the fire died to embers and the night deepened around her, Eleanor Wade found herself hoping, despite everything, that she was wrong. The sound of shouting and panicked cattle woke Eleanor before dawn 3 days later. She bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, and rushed to her window. In the pre-dawn grey, she could see dark shapes moving where they shouldn't be, her prize, breeding stock scattered across the yard instead of safely penned in the north pasture. Eleanor threw on her robe and boots, grabbing Henry's old rifle from beside the door before rushing outside. What she found made her stomach drop to her boots. The gate to the main corral hung open, twisted nearly off its hinges, and 20 head of her best cattle were wandering loose, some already heading toward the dangerous ravine that bordered the eastern edge of her property. "Michael, Thomas," she called toward the house, "get out here now." Her sons appeared within moments, Michael pulling suspenders over his nightshirt, while Thomas stumbled out, still half asleep. They took in the chaos with wide eyes. "What happened?" Michael asked, already moving toward the nearest cow. "I don't know, but we need to get them rounded up before they wander into the ravine or onto the road." Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities: storm damage, mechanical failure, or something more sinister. "Thomas, run to the barn and get the rope. Michael, help me turn them back toward the corral." What followed was 20 minutes of frantic work that reminded Eleanor painfully of how short-handed they were. With Henry gone, and their last ranch hand departed 2 weeks prior, it was just the 3 of them against 20 confused and agitated cattle. Every time they managed to get a few headed in the right direction, others would break away. "They're spooked by something," Michael panted as a particularly stubborn bull refused to be herded. "Look at their eyes, they're scared, not just wandering." Eleanor paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, and that's when she saw him. A lone rider approached from the direction of town, moving at an easy lope that suggested he was in no particular hurry. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out his impressive size, easily 6 feet tall in the saddle, with shoulders that strained his dark shirt and hands that looked capable of handling whatever trouble came his way. His horse was a magnificent black stallion that moved with the kind of trained precision that spoke of countless hours of partnership between rider and mount. The stranger reined in at the edge of their property, taking in the scene with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Eleanor felt suddenly self-conscious about her appearance, hair escaping its braid, robe pulled hastily over her nightgown, boots unlaced and muddy. "Looks like you folks could use some help," the stranger said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made both her sons stop what they were doing and listen. There was something weathered about his face, lines carved by sun and hardship, but his features were strong and honest. A neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw, and his hat was pushed back just enough to reveal dark hair touched with grey at the temples. "We're managing fine, thank you," Eleanor replied automatically, though even as she said it, 3 more cattle broke away from their makeshift corral and headed for the road. The stranger's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that." He swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, and Eleanor was struck again by his size. He had to be at least 6'4", with the kind of lean, powerful build that came from years of hard physical work. "Cade Mercer," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "mind if I lend a hand anyway?" Before Eleanor could answer, he was moving among the cattle with the confident ease of a man who understood their nature. His movements were economical and sure, never hurried, but somehow getting twice as much accomplished as her frantic efforts. Within minutes, he had the scattered animals moving in the right direction, using nothing but his voice and positioning to guide them. Michael and Thomas watched with obvious admiration as Cade worked. Eleanor found herself watching too, noting the way he handled himself with quiet competence and the respect he showed for both the animals and her property. "There's your problem," Cade called, pointing to the damaged gate. Up close, Eleanor could see that the hinges hadn't just failed, they'd been deliberately damaged. The metal twisted in a way that suggested tools rather than accident or weather. "Someone did this on purpose?" Michael's voice cracked with outrage. Cade nodded grimly. "Gates don't break like this on their own. Someone wanted your cattle loose." He examined the damage more closely, running his fingers along the twisted metal. "Recent work too. I'd say within the last few hours." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. But who would? She stopped, thinking of Theodore Hutchins's parting words about patience and offers having limits. "You got any ideas about enemies, ma'am?" Cade's blue eyes were serious now, all traces of that almost smile gone. There have been some men interested in purchasing the ranch. Some of them weren't pleased when I declined. Eleanor chose her words carefully, aware of her sons, listening intently. Cade's expression darkened. The kind of men who might think scaring a widow would change her mind. Possibly. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, despite the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. There was something dangerous in this stranger's eyes, something that spoke of violence carefully contained. Most women would have been frightened. Instead, Eleanor felt oddly reassured. "Well then," Cade said, straightening to his full impressive height, "I reckon you need more than just help with your cattle." He moved to the damaged gate and examined it more closely, then walked the fence line with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood security. Eleanor watched him work, noting the way he checked for other potential weak points and studied the approaches to her property. "You got any hands working this place?" he asked when he returned. "Not at present." Eleanor lifted her chin, preparing for the lecture she'd heard so many times before. "We've been managing on our own. 3,000 acres with just you and 2 boys?" Cade's tone held no judgment, just curiosity. "My late husband ran it with minimal help. I see no reason I can't do the same." Cade studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. "Your husband have enemies, Mrs. Wade?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "Henry? No, he was well liked by everyone. He was honest, fair in his dealings." She stopped, wondering why this stranger's opinion of Henry should matter to her. "But he's been gone how long?" 2 years this fall." Cade nodded slowly. "Long enough for certain kinds of men to start circling. Long enough to think a widow might be ready to give up the fight." "I'm not giving up anything." The words came out sharper than Eleanor intended. "Didn't say you were." Cade's voice remained calm, unruffled by her defensiveness. "But it appears someone's decided to help you make that choice." Thomas, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Are you a cowboy, mister?" Cade's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at the boy. "I've worked cattle, son, among other things. Could you teach me to rope like that, the way you move those cows around without even trying hard?" "Thomas," Eleanor warned, but Cade held up a hand. "Your mama's got every right to be careful about strangers, boy, but if she was willing, I could show you a few things." His eyes returned to Eleanor. "Fact is, Mrs. Wade, I came to Prairie Gulch looking for work. I've got experience with cattle, horses, and," he paused meaningfully, "handling men who think they can intimidate folks who can't fight back." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "What kind of experience?" "The kind that might be useful to a woman in your situation." Cade's voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of hardships and choices that had marked him permanently. "I'm not looking for charity, ma'am. I earn my keep. But I am looking for a place to settle down, and it appears you might need someone with my particular skills." Michael stepped forward, his young face serious with premature responsibility. "What kind of skills, sir?" Cade looked from Michael to Thomas, then back to Eleanor. "I can work cattle, repair fences, manage ranch operations. I can also handle men who think destroying property and scaring women makes them tough." There was steel in his voice now, quiet and implacable. "I've been drifting for a while, ma'am, looking for a place to call home, a place worth protecting." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. There was something about this man, something that spoke to the part of her that had been waiting for someone strong enough to stand beside her, rather than someone who wanted to push her aside. "What would you want in return?" she asked quietly. Cade was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made Eleanor's cheeks warm. When he spoke, his words were careful and deliberate. "I want a future, Mrs. Wade. I want to be part of something that matters. I want to help raise those boys to be men their father would be proud of." He paused, and Eleanor held her breath. "And if I prove myself worthy, if I can show you that I'm the kind of man who deserves your trust, I'd want a wife who'd stand beside me in building something lasting." The words hung in the morning air between them. Eleanor felt the world shift around her, as if everything she'd thought she knew about her situation had suddenly rearranged itself. "You're proposing to me?" she whispered. "I'm proposing to earn the right to propose to you," Cade corrected. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that some men understand the difference between taking what they want and earning what they need." Eleanor looked at her sons, who were watching this exchange with wide eyes and barely concealed hope. She thought about the long nights of worry, the mounting problems she couldn't solve alone, the parade of men who saw her family as obstacles rather than treasures. And she thought about the deliberate sabotage of her gate, the clear message that her troubles were only beginning. "What do you know about me, Mr. Mercer? About this ranch? I know you're Henry Wade's widow, and that Henry Wade had a reputation as an honest man who built something worth having. I know you've got 2 sons who need guidance and a ranch that needs protecting. I know you're proud and stubborn and not inclined to trust easily." His mouth quirked in that almost smile again. "And I know that any man worth having would consider himself lucky to be part of what you're trying to preserve here." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "And what should I know about you?" Cade's expression grew serious again. "You should know that I've done things I'm not proud of, Mrs. Wade. You should know that there are men who'd call me dangerous, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. But you should also know that I've never hurt anyone who didn't deserve hurting, and I've never taken anything that wasn't offered freely." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the honesty in his blue eyes despite the shadows that lurked there. "How long were you planning to stay in Prairie Gulch, Mr. Mercer?" "That depends on you, ma'am." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood at the edge of a cliff with no way to see the bottom. But looking at her sons, at the hope in their faces, and the way they'd already begun to straighten their shoulders in this stranger's presence, she realized that staying where she was might be more dangerous than jumping. "We'll try it for a month," she said finally. "You can stay in the bunkhouse and work the ranch. At the end of that time, we'll discuss other arrangements." Cade's smile was slow and genuine, transforming his weathered features. "Yes, ma'am. You won't regret this." Eleanor watched him shake hands solemnly with both her sons, noting how he treated them with the respect of equals rather than children. As he moved to examine the rest of their damaged property, she found herself wondering what she'd just committed herself to. But for the first time in 2 years, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. 3 days into Cade Mercer's trial period, Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching him work with Thomas in the yard behind the house. Her younger son clutched a makeshift slingshot, whittled from an oak branch and strung with leather cord, his face set with fierce concentration as he aimed at a row of tin cans. Cade had arranged along the fence rail. The slingshot had been Thomas's attempt at creating his own weapon after watching Cade handle the scattered cattle with such effortless skill. Eleanor had initially been alarmed to find her 12-year-old son crafting projectile weapons, but Cade had approached the situation with characteristic pragmatism. "Boy's got good instincts," he'd told Eleanor that morning. "He sees threats to his family and wants to be able to defend them. Nothing wrong with that impulse, just needs proper channeling." Now, as Eleanor watched through the window, she could see Cade crouched beside Thomas, his large hands guiding her son's smaller ones as he demonstrated the proper stance and release. There was infinite patience in Cade's manner, no trace of condescension or irritation, as Thomas missed the cans repeatedly. "Remember what I told you about breathing?" Cade's voice carried clearly through the open window. "Draw back, focus on your target, exhale slowly, and release at the bottom of your breath." Thomas nodded solemnly, repositioning himself with the gravity of a much older person. This time, his shot clipped the edge of the leftmost can, sending it spinning. The boy's whoop of triumph made Eleanor smile, despite her lingering reservations about her impulsive decision to let this stranger into their lives. "I hit it! Did you see that, Mr. Cade? I actually hit it." "I saw," Cade said, and Eleanor could hear the genuine pride in his voice. "Good shooting, son. Now let's work on consistency. A man needs to be able to count on his skills when it matters." Eleanor turned away from the window, troubled by how easily the word son had rolled off Cade's tongue. In just 3 days, both her boys had begun gravitating toward him with an eagerness that was both gratifying and slightly frightening. They hung on his every word, competed for his attention, and had begun unconsciously mimicking his mannerisms and speech patterns. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair damp with sweat from the morning's work. At 14, he was rapidly developing the lean strength that would eventually make him a formidable man, but right now he still carried traces of boyish awkwardness in his movements. "Mama, Mr. Cade wants to know if you've got any spare leather for mending the harness. He says the workhorse's gear is about to give out completely." Eleanor nodded, mentally adding harness repair to her growing list of things Cade had identified as needing attention. In 3 days, he'd catalogued every weak point on the property with the thoroughness of a military strategist. Loose fence posts, damaged gates, worn equipment, nothing escaped his notice. "Tell him to check the storage room off the barn. There should be leather scraps in the large wooden box." Michael started to leave, then paused. "Mama, are you angry that we like him?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "What makes you ask that? You get this look sometimes when you watch us with Mr. Cade, like you're worried about something." Michael's young face was earnest with concern. "Thomas thinks you might change your mind about letting him stay." Eleanor set down her coffee cup and really looked at her elder son. When had he become so observant, so attuned to adult concerns? "I'm not angry, sweetheart. I'm just cautious. We don't know very much about Mr. Mercer yet. But he's helping us, and he treats us like we matter, not like we're in the way." Michael's voice carried a note of pleading that made Eleanor's heart ache. "Some of the men who come calling act like we're problems to be solved. Mr. Cade acts like we're worth knowing." 9. Eleanor pulled Michael into a quick hug, marveling at how tall he'd grown. "You are worth knowing, both of you. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." "Then why are you worried about him?" Eleanor searched for words that would explain her complex feelings without burdening Michael with adult concerns. "Because caring about people means you can get hurt when they leave. And people do leave, Michael, even when they don't want to." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You mean like Papa did?" "Yes, like Papa did, and I'm trying to protect us all from that kind of hurt again. But Mr. Cade isn't sick like Papa was, and he chose to be here. Doesn't that make it different?" Out of the mouths of babes, Eleanor thought. Michael's simple logic cut through her complicated fears with uncomfortable precision. Cade had chosen to be here, had specifically asked for the chance to prove himself. That was indeed different from losing someone to illness and circumstance. "You're a wise boy, Michael Wade," she said finally. "Wiser than your mother sometimes." Michael grinned, the first truly carefree expression she'd seen from him in months. "Does that mean he can stay past the month?" "It means I'm willing to see how things develop." Eleanor smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "But I need you to promise me something. If Mr. Cade ever makes you uncomfortable, if he ever treats you or Thomas in a way that doesn't feel right, you tell me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. But I don't think that's going to happen." "Why not?" "Because of the way he talks about Papa. He didn't know him, but he speaks about him with respect, like Papa was someone worth honoring." Michael's voice grew thoughtful. "Men who respect the dead usually respect the living too, don't they?" Eleanor stared at her son, amazed once again by his insight. "Yes," she said quietly, "they usually do." After Michael returned to his work, Eleanor found herself thinking about the changes 3 days had brought to the ranch. The broken gate had been repaired with new hinges that would take considerable force to damage. The scattered cattle were secure in reinforced pens. The fence lines that had been sagging were now taut and properly braced. But the changes went beyond physical repairs. There was something different in the air, a sense of purpose and security that had been missing since Henry's death. Her sons moved with more confidence, laughed more easily, spoke with excitement about learning new skills. Even the animals seemed calmer, responding to Cade's quiet authority with the kind of trust that couldn't be faked. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor looked out to see 3 riders approaching the house, and her stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. She recognized the lead rider immediately, Jeremiah Blackwood, owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory, and a man whose very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Blackwood was a tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of pale eyes that never seemed to show emotion. He dressed expensively but practically, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to getting his way. The 2 men with him were clearly hired hands, their hands resting casually on their sidearms in a way that was meant to be noticed. Eleanor dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the front porch, acutely aware that she was alone with her sons and a ranch hand she barely knew. Through the kitchen window, she could see Cade straightening from his work with Thomas, his attention focused on the approaching riders with the alertness of a predator sensing potential threat. "Mrs. Wade," Blackwood called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "What a pleasure to see you looking so well. I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit." "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor kept her voice carefully neutral, "what brings you to my ranch?" "Neighborly concern, my dear. I've been hearing troubling reports about difficulties you've been experiencing. Vandalism, I'm told, most distressing for a woman in your position." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Word traveled fast in Prairie Gulch, but not usually this fast unless someone had reason to spread it. "Nothing I can't handle, thank you." "Oh, but my dear Eleanor, that's precisely the point. You shouldn't have to handle such things. A woman alone, trying to manage a property this size, it's simply not natural. Not safe." Blackwood's pale eyes swept over the ranch with proprietorial interest. "I've come to renew my offer. A generous offer, I might add. More than fair market value for the land and buildings. And I'll give you the same answer I gave you 6 months ago, Mr. Blackwood. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price, Eleanor. And circumstances have a way of changing, don't they?" His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I understand you've taken on a drifter. Quite the risk, trusting a stranger with your property and your sons." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. "My hiring decisions are my own concern." Of course, though I do hope you've checked his references thoroughly. So many dangerous men wandering the territory these days. Men with violent pasts, criminal histories, why, a trusting widow might find herself in terrible danger before she realized her mistake. Eleanor was about to respond when she became aware of Cade's presence behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there. His impressive frame filling the doorway, his blue eyes fixed on Blackwood with unmistakable menace. "Problem here, Mrs. Wade?" Cade's voice was conversational, but there was steel underneath that made Blackwood's hired guns shift uneasily in their saddles. "Mr. Blackwood was just leaving," Eleanor said firmly. Blackwood's eyes assessed Cade with the calculation of a man who understood violence. Whatever he saw there made his smile falter slightly. "And you must be the new ranch hand, Jeremiah Blackwood." He didn't offer his hand. "Cade Mercer." Cade's stance was relaxed but ready, his right hand hanging loose near his hip in a way that suggested long-practiced habits. "You have business with Mrs. Wade?" "Business opportunities, you might say, though I suspect they wouldn't interest a mere employee." Blackwood's tone was dismissive, but his eyes never left Cade's face. "You'd be surprised what interests me, Mr. Blackwood, especially when it comes to protecting what matters." The 2 men studied each other in the kind of charged silence that preceded either violence or retreat. Eleanor held her breath, sensing currents of danger she didn't fully understand. Finally, Blackwood stepped back, his smile returning with renewed falseness. "Well, Eleanor, I can see you're in capable hands for the moment. Do give my offer some thought, won't you? These sorts of arrangements," his eyes flicked meaningfully toward Cade, "rarely last as long as one hopes. And when they end, well, a woman alone needs alternatives." He remounted his horse with practiced ease, but Eleanor noticed that both his men kept their eyes on Cade until they were well clear of the yard. Only when the sound of hooves faded did she realize she'd been holding her breath. "Friend of yours?" Cade asked quietly. "Hardly. He's been trying to buy the ranch since Henry died. Each time I refuse, his offers become more persistent." Cade's jaw tightened. "And his visits more intimidating?" Eleanor nodded, suddenly grateful for Cade's solid presence beside her. "He's made it clear that he considers my refusal a temporary inconvenience." "Men like that usually do." Cade's voice was thoughtful. "Question is whether he's the type to escalate beyond intimidation." The casual way Cade spoke of escalation sent a chill through Eleanor. "What do you mean?" "I mean your gate didn't damage itself, Mrs. Wade, and men who make threats usually follow through if they think they can get away with it." Cade turned to face her fully. "How badly does Blackwood want this land?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Badly enough to make offers well above market value. This ranch sits between his property and the railroad depot. Controlling it would give him significant advantages in shipping his cattle." "Advantages worth more than he's offering you?" "Considerably more, yes." Cade nodded grimly. "Then we should expect more trouble. Men like Blackwood don't give up easy when the stakes are high." Eleanor felt a flutter of fear, not for herself but for her sons. "What kind of trouble?" "Hard to say. Could be more property damage, attempts to drive off your livestock, maybe pressure on your suppliers or buyers. Could escalate to direct threats if he gets desperate enough." Cade's blue eyes met hers steadily. "But that's why you've got me here now. And I don't scare easy." Eleanor studied his weathered face, seeing something in his expression that spoke of experience with exactly this kind of situation. "You've dealt with men like Blackwood before?" It wasn't a question, and Cade didn't treat it like one. "I have. They're all the same underneath bullies who mistake money for strength and intimidation for intelligence. The key is making sure they understand that their usual tactics won't work." "And how do you do that?" Cade's smile was thin and dangerous. "By being more intimidating than they are, ma'am. By making it clear that threatening you and your boys comes with consequences they won't enjoy." Eleanor felt a complex mix of gratitude and unease. She needed protection, but the casual competence with which Cade discussed violence reminded her that she still knew very little about this man she'd invited into their lives. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "I appreciate your willingness to help, but I don't want my sons exposed to—" "To what, ma'am?" "To the reality that sometimes good people have to stand up to bad ones. That sometimes protecting what matters requires more than just asking nicely." Cade's voice was gentle but firm. "Your boys are already exposed to that reality, Mrs. Wade. Blackwood's visit just now proved it. The question isn't whether they'll learn about conflict, it's whether they'll learn to handle it with courage and integrity." Eleanor looked toward the yard where Thomas was still practicing with his slingshot, his young face set with determination. Michael emerged from the barn, his eyes automatically scanning the area where Blackwood's horses had been, already learning to be alert for threats. "They're growing up too fast," she murmured. "They're growing up in a hard world," Cade said quietly. "But that doesn't mean they have to grow up hard. The right guidance can teach them to be strong without being cruel, protective without being aggressive. Your late husband understood that, didn't he?" Eleanor nodded, remembering Henry's quiet strength and moral certainty. "He did. He always said that a man's character was measured not by his willingness to fight, but by what he was willing to fight for." "Smart man," Cade said. "And he was right. Your boys will face challenges, Mrs. Wade. Men like Blackwood, other kinds of trouble as they get older. But if they learn to stand up for what's right, if they understand the difference between violence and defense, between strength and bullying, well, that's the kind of teaching that shapes good men." Eleanor found herself studying Cade's profile as he watched her sons, noting the way his expression softened when he looked at them. Despite his obvious capacity for violence, despite the dangerous competence he'd displayed in dealing with Blackwood, there was genuine warmth in his regard for Michael and Thomas. "You care about them," she said, surprised by the realization. Cade was quiet for a moment. "I do, more than I expected to. Truth be told, They're good boys, Mrs. Wade. They've got their father's character and their mother's heart. That's a rare combination. Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest, not just gratitude, but something deeper and more complicated. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing them as they are instead of as problems to be managed. For treating them like they matter." Cade turned to meet her eyes. "They do matter, Mrs. Wade. And so do you. That's something Blackwood and his kind will never understand, that a family's worth can't be measured in dollars or acres. But it can be protected by people who do understand that." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple recognition of her family's value. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged their worth as people, rather than obstacles or opportunities. "Mrs. Wade," Cade's voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" Eleanor wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by her emotional response. "I'm sorry. It's been a long time since someone understood." "Nothing to apologize for," Cade said firmly. "And for what it's worth, I think your husband would be proud of how you've held things together. It takes real strength to do what you've been doing." Eleanor felt a flash of something that might have been hope. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who truly understood what she was trying to protect and why it mattered. Someone willing to stand with her instead of trying to take over. Time would tell. But for now, watching her sons practice their skills under Cade's patient guidance, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that their month-long trial might lead to something more permanent and more precious than she'd dared to dream. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table that evening, her mother's worn Bible open before her, as she sought guidance in the familiar verses that had comforted her through countless difficulties. The leather cover was cracked with age and use, the pages soft from decades of handling, and the margins filled with notations in 3 different hands: her grandmother's precise script, her mother's flowing cursive, and her own careful printing. She'd inherited more than just the book from the women who came before her. She'd inherited their faith, their strength, and their wisdom about navigating the complex challenges of loving and protecting a family. Tonight, she found herself particularly drawn to the passage in Proverbs about trusting in the Lord with all your heart and not leaning on your own understanding. The problem was, Eleanor's understanding seemed to be all she had to rely on these days. A soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Cade's tall silhouette, outlined against the lamplight from the bunkhouse. Her pulse quickened involuntarily, a response that both pleased and troubled her. "Come in," she called, marking her place in the Bible with a ribbon bookmark her mother had tatted years ago. Cade entered, hat in hand, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the day's work. In the warm lamplight of the kitchen, Eleanor was struck once again by his presence, the way he seemed to fill the space not just with his physical size, but with an energy that was both calming and electric. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, Mum. Saw your light was still on, and thought I should report on the day's work." Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be kind. Thank you." Eleanor busied herself with the coffee pot, acutely aware of Cade's eyes following her movements. When she turned back with 2 cups, she found him studying the open Bible with interest, rather than the discomfort many men showed around obvious displays of faith. "My mother's Bible," Eleanor explained, settling back into her chair. 3 generations of women have found strength in these pages. "Strong women, I'd guess," Cade said, accepting his coffee with a nod of thanks. "Takes strength to hold on to faith when life gets hard." "You speak like a man who understands that struggle." Cade was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I've had my share of hard times, Mrs. Wade. Times when faith felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, but I've learned that's usually when you need it most." Eleanor felt a flutter of curiosity about the experiences that had shaped this complex man. "Are you a religious man, Mr. Mercer?" "I try to be. Don't always succeed, but I try." Cade's smile was rueful. "Your boys asked me about church this morning. Seems they haven't been attending regular since their father died." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was true she'd found it difficult to face the well-meaning but pointed questions from other congregants, the barely veiled suggestions about what she should do with her life and her ranch. I'm afraid I've been remiss in that area. Nothing to be ashamed of. Grief affects folks in different ways, but the boys mentioned they'd like to start going again, if you're agreeable. I told them that was between them and their mother, but that I'd be honored to escort you all if you decided to return. Eleanor studied Cade's earnest expression, touched by his respectful approach to what could have been a difficult topic. You'd be willing to attend services with us? I'd be proud to, ma'am. Been too long since I sat in a proper church myself. Eleanor found herself imagining walking into Sunday services with Cade beside her, the inevitable gossip and speculation that would follow. But she also imagined the comfort of having his steady presence at her side, the message it would send that she and her sons were no longer entirely alone and vulnerable. Yes, I think we'd like that, she said finally. The boys do miss it, and I suppose I've been hiding long enough. Not hiding, Cade corrected gently. Healing. There's a difference. Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee spread through her chest. When had anyone last understood her motivations so clearly, so kindly? Now then, Cade said, apparently sensing her need to change the subject, about today's work. I've repaired the harness and checked all the equipment in the barn. You've got some good pieces, but several need replacement soon. I can make a list if you'd like. Please do. I'm afraid I've been putting off too many maintenance issues. Understandable, given your circumstances, but we should prioritize the most critical repairs. Cade pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. I took the liberty of making some notes. The water pump needs new gaskets, the feed bins have loose boards that'll let in moisture, and you're going to need a new wagon wheel before winter. Eleanor reviewed his neat handwriting, noting the careful organization and practical priorities. This is quite thorough. You have experience managing ranch operations? Some. Yes, ma'am. I've worked for several outfits over the years, learned to see what needs doing before it becomes a crisis. Cade paused. I also wanted to discuss security measures. After Blackwood's visit today, I think we need to be more vigilant. Eleanor's stomach tightened. You really think he'll cause more trouble? I think he's the type of man who doesn't take no for an answer, especially when money's involved. He made it clear today that he considers my presence here a temporary inconvenience. Cade's expression grew serious. I'd like to implement some precautions. Nothing dramatic, but sensible measures to protect the property and your family. What kind of measures? Better locks on the buildings, a routine for checking the livestock twice daily, some basic signals so the boys can alert us if they see anything suspicious. Cade leaned forward slightly. And Mrs. Wade, I think you and the boys should learn to handle firearms properly. Not because I expect trouble, but because preparation prevents panic. Eleanor felt a chill of fear. You think it might come to that? I think a woman and her children should never be helpless in the face of threats. Your husband would have wanted you protected, wouldn't he? Eleanor thought of Henry's gentle nature, his hatred of violence, but also his fierce protectiveness when it came to his family. Yes, she said quietly, he would have. Then let me teach you. Basic handling, safe storage, accuracy at short range. Nothing more than any frontier family should know, but enough to give you confidence and options. Eleanor studied Cade's face, seeing no eagerness for violence there, only practical concern for their safety. You make it sound routine, because it should be routine, ma'am. A gun is a tool, no different from a hammer or a saw. Dangerous if misused, invaluable when needed, and most effective when the person holding it knows what they're doing. Eleanor considered this perspective, remembering her own father's lessons about respecting firearms as tools rather than fearing them as demons. Very well, but I want to be present when you teach the boys. Wouldn't have it any other way. This is family business, Mrs. Wade. We do it together. The casual use of the word we sent another flutter through Eleanor's chest. When had Cade begun thinking of himself as part of their family unit? When had she begun wanting him to? "There's something else," Cade continued. "I'd like to ride the property lines tomorrow, get a full picture of your boundaries and any potential vulnerabilities. Would you be comfortable with me being away for most of the day?" Eleanor realized she wasn't entirely comfortable with that, not because she didn't trust him, but because his presence had become reassuring in ways she hadn't expected. "Of course, the boys and I managed on our own for 2 years. We can certainly handle one day." Cade's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Independent as always, Mrs. Wade. Is that a criticism?" "It's an admiration, though I hope you understand that accepting help doesn't diminish your independence. Sometimes it just makes it sustainable." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. There was something in his expression that suggested he was talking about more than just ranch work. "Mr. Mercer," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that had been building in her mind. "Yes, ma'am. This arrangement we have, this trial period, what happens if it works out? What happens if we all decide you should stay permanently?" Cade set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. "That depends on what you're asking, Mrs. Wade." Eleanor felt her heart beating against her ribs. "I'm asking what you envision for the future, what you're hoping for." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. "I'm hoping for a family, Mrs. Wade. I'm hoping for a place where I belong, where my presence makes things better instead of more complicated. I'm hoping for sons to guide and a wife to cherish." His voice grew softer. "I'm hoping for love that's real and lasting, built on respect and shared purpose." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "And if I can't give you that? If I can't move past my grief, my fear of trusting again, then I'll stay as long as you'll have me as a friend and employee, and I'll be grateful for the privilege of being part of your boys' lives in whatever capacity you allow." Cade reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "But Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? I think you're stronger and more ready for love than you give yourself credit for." The gentle use of her first name sent warmth flooding through Eleanor's entire body. She looked down at their joined hands, his so large and work-roughened, hers smaller and pale by comparison, and felt something shift in her chest. "I'm frightened," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of caring too much, of losing someone again, of making the wrong choice and hurting my sons." Eleanor met his eyes. "Of not being worthy of the kind of love you're offering." Cade's thumb traced gently across her knuckles. "Eleanor Wade, you are the strongest, most devoted mother I've ever encountered. You've held your family together through grief and hardship with nothing but determination and love. Any man worthy of you would consider himself blessed beyond measure." Eleanor felt tears spill over onto her cheeks. "How can you be so certain? You barely know me." "I know that you put your children's needs above your own comfort every single day. I know that you've maintained your integrity despite pressure from men who'd prefer you weak and compliant. I know that you work harder than most ranch hands I've met and never complain about the burden." Cade's voice grew tender. "And I know that the woman who reads her mother's Bible by lamplight and worries about her sons' souls is exactly the kind of woman a man dreams of spending his life beside." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. When had anyone last seen her so clearly, appreciated her so completely? "Cade," she said, and his name felt natural on her lips. "I need time. I need to be sure this is right for all of us." "Take all the time you need," he said simply. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor, not unless you send me away." Eleanor squeezed his hand, marveling at the strength and gentleness she found there. "Thank you for understanding, for being patient." "Thank you for giving me hope," Cade replied. "It's been a long time since I had anything worth hoping for." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands linked across the table, the Bible open between them like a blessing. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch created a peaceful backdrop, cattle lowing softly, the distant call of an owl, the gentle whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. For the first time since Henry's death, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, but about joy, partnership, and love. It was a terrifying prospect, but as she looked into Cade's honest blue eyes, she began to think it might also be a beautiful one. Eleanor's fingers traced the worn gold case of Henry's pocket watch as she sat on the front porch 2 weeks later, watching the sun paint the prairie in shades of amber and rose. The timepiece had been her husband's most prized possession, a wedding gift from his father that he'd carried every day of their marriage. She'd kept it close since his death, sometimes pressing it to her ear just to hear its steady ticking, a reminder that time continued even when your world stopped. But tonight, as she held the familiar weight in her palm, Eleanor found herself thinking not about the past, but about the future. The watch's hands pointed towards 7 o'clock, nearly time for Cade to return from town, where he'd gone to pick up supplies and, she suspected, to gather information about any threats to their safety. The past 2 weeks had brought changes she couldn't have imagined when she'd first agreed to let Cade stay. Her sons had begun to stand taller, speak more confidently, approach each day with enthusiasm instead of merely enduring it. Michael had started taking initiative with ranch work that went beyond his assigned chores, and Thomas had channeled his restless energy into learning skills that would serve him well as he grew to manhood. But perhaps the most significant change was in Eleanor herself. She caught herself humming while she worked, looking forward to conversations at the dinner table, feeling anticipation for each new day instead of simply grateful to have survived another one. The constant weight of anxiety that had pressed on her shoulders for 2 years had lightened to something manageable. The sound of approaching hooves made her look up, and she felt the familiar flutter in her chest as Cade came into view. He rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his black stallion responding to invisible signals with perfect precision. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the alertness in his posture, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. As he dismounted near the barn, their eyes met across the yard, and Cade's serious expression softened into something warmer. He touched the brim of his hat in greeting, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the simple gesture. When had she become so affected by this man's smallest attentions? "Mama?" Thomas appeared at her elbow, following her gaze toward Cade, with knowing eyes that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old. "Are you going to marry Mr. Cade?" Eleanor's breath caught. "Thomas, what kind of question is that?" The kind a boy asks when he sees his mama blushing every time a certain cowboy looks at her. Thomas settled beside her on the porch step, with a matter-of-fact directness that reminded Eleanor painfully of Henry. "Michael and I have been talking about it." Eleanor set the pocket watch carefully in her lap, buying time to formulate an appropriate response. "What you and Michael discuss isn't necessarily, 'We think you should,'" Thomas interrupted with the confidence of youth. "Mr. Cade's good to us, Mama. He teaches us things Papa would have taught us, and he looks at you like Papa used to look at you." Eleanor turned to study her younger son's earnest face. "How do you remember how Papa looked at me? You were so young." "I remember the important things, like how his face would get soft when you came into a room, and how he'd find reasons to touch your hand when he thought we weren't looking." Thomas's voice grew wistful. "Mr. Cade does that too. He thinks he's being subtle, but Michael and I notice everything." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. "Thomas, marriage is complicated. It's not just about caring for someone. But you do care for him, don't you? And he cares for us. Isn't that what families are supposed to be? People who care for each other?" Before Eleanor could respond, Michael appeared from the house, drawn by the sound of their voices. At 14, he was developing Henry's thoughtful nature, the tendency to consider all angles before speaking. But when he looked at Eleanor, his expression was as hopeful as Thomas's. "Are we talking about Mr. Cade?" he asked, settling on Eleanor's other side. "Thomas was asking impertinent questions about my private feelings," Eleanor said, though without real reproach. "They're not really private though, are they, Mama?" Michael's voice was gentle but persistent. "We all live together, eat together, work together. When you're happy, we're happy. When you're worried, we worry too. Eleanor looked between her sons, marveling at their insight and maturity. And you think Mr. Cade makes me happy? We know he does, Thomas said firmly. You laugh more now. You sing while you're cooking. You don't get that scared look when problems come up because you know he'll help figure them out. And he makes us happy too, Michael added. He treats us like we matter, like we're already the men we're going to become, instead of just problems to be managed until we grow up. Eleanor felt her heart swell with love for these remarkable boys who had somehow managed to grow wise despite their young ages and difficult circumstances. What are you asking me exactly? We're asking if you love him, Thomas said with characteristic directness, and if you do, why you're trying so hard to fight it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching Cade as he unsaddled his horse and spoke quietly to the animal. His movements were efficient and practiced, but she could see the genuine affection in the way he handled the stallion, the care he took with every aspect of his responsibilities. I do love him, she admitted quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. But loving someone doesn't automatically mean marrying them. There are other considerations. Like what? Michael asked. Like whether I'm ready to trust someone with our future again. Like whether it's fair to ask Mr. Cade to take on the responsibility of raising another man's sons. Like whether I'm capable of being the kind of wife he deserves after being alone for so long. Thomas reached over and took her hand with touching solemnity. Mama, Mr. Cade told me something yesterday when we were working on the fence repair. He said that love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. Every day you choose to love someone, and they choose to love you back, and that's what makes a family. Eleanor stared at her younger son, amazed by the wisdom in his simple words. He said that? He said Papa chose to love you every day, and that's why you had such a good marriage. And he said if he was lucky enough to earn your love, he'd choose you every day for the rest of his life. Thomas squeezed her fingers. That sounds like the kind of man Papa would want taking care of us, doesn't it? Eleanor felt tears spill over onto her cheeks. The image of Cade sharing such thoughts with her son, speaking of Henry with respect rather than jealousy, painted a picture of the kind of man she'd begun to hope he might be. What do you two think about the idea of having a stepfather? She asked carefully. We think we'd be lucky, Michael said immediately. We know he can never replace Papa, and he's never tried to. But he could be something different, something we need now, a man to learn from, to count on, to help us become the kind of men Papa would be proud of. And he loves you, Mama, Thomas added. Really loves you, not just wants to own you like those other men who come around. We can tell the difference. Eleanor marveled at her son's perceptiveness. They had indeed learned to distinguish between men who saw their family as an acquisition and a man who saw them as treasures to be cherished. There's something else you should know, she said, deciding they deserved honesty. Mr. Cade wasn't always a ranch hand. He has a past, a complicated one that might bring danger to our lives. What kind of past? Michael asked, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely surprised. He was a gunfighter, a very skilled one, from what I understand. He's trying to leave that life behind, but sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Thomas and Michael exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. We kind of figured, Thomas said finally. The way he handles himself, the way other people react to him, it was pretty obvious he wasn't just any cowboy. And you're not afraid? Eleanor asked. Should we be afraid of him? Michael countered. Eleanor considered the question seriously. No, I truly believe he would never hurt us, but his reputation might attract the kind of people who could hurt us. So we'd have to be careful, Thomas said pragmatically. But we already have to be careful because of Mr. Blackwood and his threats. At least, with Mr. Cade, we'd have someone who could protect us, instead of just hoping trouble doesn't find us. Eleanor was struck once again by her son's mature reasoning. They had assessed the situation with clear eyes and reached conclusions based on practical considerations rather than romantic notions. You've both given this a lot of thought, she observed. We love you, Mama, Michael said simply. We want you to be happy, and we want to learn to be good men. Mr. Cade can help with both of those things." Eleanor looked toward the barn, where Cade was now brushing down his horse, his movements methodical and patient. As if sensing her attention, he looked up and their eyes met across the yard. Even from a distance, she could see the warmth in his expression, the way his entire demeanor softened when he looked at her. "He asked me to marry him," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Both boys straightened with excitement. "When?" Thomas demanded. "A few days ago. Not formally, more like a statement of intention. He said he wanted to court me properly, to earn the right to ask for my hand in marriage." "And what did you tell him?" Michael asked. "I told him I needed time to think." Thomas rolled his eyes with pre-adolescent exasperation. "Mama, what's to think about? He's perfect for us." "No one's perfect, sweetheart." "But—" Eleanor paused, watching Cade as he finished his work and began walking toward the house. "He might be perfect for us. So tell him yes," Thomas exclaimed. "It's not that simple." "Sure it is," Michael interrupted, with a maturity that reminded Eleanor he was rapidly becoming a young man. "Either you trust him or you don't. Either you love him or you don't. Either you want to spend your life with him or you don't. Everything else is just fear talking." Eleanor stared at her elder son, recognizing Henry's wisdom in the boy's straightforward logic. When had Michael become so insightful about matters of the heart? "You sound like your father," she murmured. "Good," Michael said firmly. "Papa would tell you the same thing if he were here. He'd want you to be happy, Mama. He'd want us all to be happy." As Cade approached the porch, Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. The conversation with her sons had clarified feelings she'd been trying to avoid, forced her to confront the simple truth that love, real, lasting love, was indeed about choosing each other every day. "Evening, Mrs. Wade, boys," Cade said as he reached the bottom of the porch steps. "Beautiful sunset tonight." "Mr. Cade," Thomas said with the enthusiasm that had become his hallmark when addressing their hired hand, "Mama has something she wants to tell you." "Thomas!" Eleanor gasped, heat flooding her cheeks. Cade's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Does she now?" Michael stood up with dignity beyond his years. "Come on, Thomas. Let's go check on the chickens before it gets full dark." "But I want to hear," Thomas began. "Now, Thomas." Michael's tone brooked no argument, and with surprising grace for a 12-year-old, Thomas allowed himself to be led away, though not without shooting Eleanor an encouraging look over his shoulder. Eleanor found herself alone with Cade in the gathering twilight, Henry's pocket watch still warm in her palm. Cade settled onto the porch step beside her, close enough that she could smell the familiar sense of leather and honest work that seemed to cling to him. "Whatever they think you need to tell me can wait," Cade said quietly. "First, tell me how you've been while I was gone. Any problems?" Eleanor shook her head, touched by his immediate concern for their welfare. "No problems. The boys finished the fence repairs you marked, and I got caught up on the household accounts. How was town?" Cade's expression grew serious. "Interesting. I had a conversation with Sheriff Morrison about your situation with Blackwood. Seems there have been several other ranchers who've had difficulties after refusing Blackwood's offers to buy their land." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of difficulties? Mysterious accidents, livestock going missing, equipment being sabotaged. The kind of trouble that's hard to prove but impossible to ignore." Cade's blue eyes met hers steadily. "Morrison's a good man, but he can only do so much without proof. And Blackwood's careful to keep his hands clean, so we're on our own." "Not necessarily. I also talked to a few other ranch owners who've dealt with Blackwood's pressure. There's talk of forming an association, mutual protection, and shared resources. Strength in numbers." Eleanor considered this. "Would that help?" "It might. Men like Blackwood prefer isolated targets. If he knows that threatening you means dealing with a dozen other armed ranchers, he might think twice about escalating." Cade paused. "But Eleanor, there's something else you need to know. The serious tone of his voice made Eleanor's pulse quicken. "What is it? Morrison told me that Blackwood's been asking questions about me, about my background, where I came from, why I'm here." Cade's jaw tightened. "He's looking for leverage, something he can use to drive a wedge between us or discredit me in the community." Eleanor felt cold despite the warm evening air. Will he find what he's looking for? Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. He might. "My past isn't something I can hide forever, especially not from a man with Blackwood's resources and connections." "Then maybe it's time you told me about it," Eleanor said softly. "All of it." Cade turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his blue eyes. "Are you sure you want to know? Some truths change how people see each other." "I'm sure." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, though her heart was pounding. "If we're going to face whatever comes next together, I need to understand who you really are." Cade nodded slowly. "You remember I told you I'd been a gunfighter?" "Yes." "What I didn't tell you was that I was very good at it. Too good." Cade's voice grew quiet, reflective. "They called me the Ghost of Tombstone. For 5 years, I lived by my guns, taking jobs that other men wouldn't take, going places that other men couldn't go." Eleanor absorbed this information, noting the pain in Cade's expression as he spoke of his past. "What changed?" "A job went wrong, a job that I thought was about justice but turned out to be about revenge. A good man died because I believed the wrong person's story, and I realized that living by violence, even for supposedly good reasons, was poisoning everything decent in me." Eleanor thought about this, remembering her earlier conversation with her sons about choosing love every day. "So you stopped." "I tried to stop, but when you live by reputation, reputation follows you. There were always men who wanted to prove themselves by facing the ghost, always people who wanted to use my skills for their own purposes." Cade's hands clenched into fists. "I spent 3 years drifting, trying to outrun who I'd been, looking for a place where I could be someone different. And you found it here. I thought I had. But men like Blackwood don't care about redemption. They see only what they can use." Cade turned to face Eleanor fully. "If he spreads word about my past, it could bring trouble to your doorstep. Bounty hunters, men looking to make reputations, people with old grudges, any number of complications you and the boys don't deserve." Eleanor felt fear flutter in her chest, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger, protective fury, at the thought of anyone threatening the peace Cade had worked so hard to build. "Let me ask you something," she said quietly. "In all those years as a gunfighter, did you ever kill a man who didn't deserve killing?" Cade's answer came without hesitation. "No. I made mistakes about who deserved what, but I never killed an innocent man." "Did you ever hurt a woman or child?" "Never." "Did you ever take money for something that went against your conscience?" Cade was quiet longer this time. "Once, early on, before I learned to ask better questions. It's the mistake that made me more careful about the jobs I accepted." Eleanor nodded, processing this information. "The man you are now, the man who's been patient with my sons, respectful of my late husband's memory, gentle with frightened animals, is that man real, or is he a performance?" "He's real," Cade said firmly. "More real than I've ever been. Being here, being part of your family, has shown me who I could be if I had something worth being better for." Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes. "Then that's the man I choose to know. That's the man I choose to trust." Cade stared at her. "Even knowing what I've done, what I might bring to your door?" "Especially knowing that." Eleanor reached over and took his hand. "Cade, everyone has a past. The question isn't what you've done, it's who you're choosing to be now. And the man you're choosing to be is someone I can love without reservation." Cade's breath caught. "Eleanor, I love you," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I love your patience with my sons, your respect for my independence, your willingness to let me grieve my first husband without being threatened by his memory. I love your strength and your gentleness and your determination to be better than your past." Cade lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you too, Eleanor Wade, more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." They sat in the growing darkness, hands linked, hearts finally open to each other. Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble, replaced by a joy so intense it almost frightened her. "There's something else," she said softly. "The boys and I had a conversation tonight. About us. About the future." "What did they say?" Eleanor smiled through her tears. "They said I should stop being afraid and marry you." Cade's answering smile was brilliant in the twilight. "Smart boys. They are. They're also right." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Cade Mercer, I would be honored to be your wife." Cade cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Eleanor Wade, you've just made me the luckiest man in the territory." When he kissed her, soft and reverent in the purple twilight, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Henry's death, the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. As they broke apart, Eleanor realized she was still holding Henry's pocket watch. The steady ticking seemed to approve, as if her first husband's spirit was blessing this new beginning. She looked at the timepiece one last time, then carefully tucked it into her apron pocket. It was time to stop living in the past and start building the future. The jingle of new spurs echoed across the ranch yard as Michael walked with the careful precision of a young man, learning to carry himself with dignity. Cade had presented the spurs to him the morning after Eleanor accepted his proposal, a symbolic recognition that Michael was no longer just a boy helping with chores, but a young man taking on real responsibilities. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as her elder son worked alongside Cade, their movements synchronized in the way that spoke of weeks of shared labor and growing trust. Michael had gained inches in height and confidence since Cade's arrival, his shoulders broader now and his voice deeper when he spoke with the authority of someone who knew his work mattered. "They look like a real team out there," came Thomas's voice from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find her younger son studying the scene with satisfaction. At 12, Thomas was still all energy and enthusiasm, but even he had begun to show signs of the steady man he would become under Cade's guidance. "Yes, they do," Eleanor agreed, feeling the familiar flutter of joy and amazement that had become her constant companions since accepting Cade's proposal 3 weeks earlier. The engagement had transformed the atmosphere of the ranch in ways both subtle and profound. There was a sense of permanence now, of building something that would last beyond mere survival. Cade no longer slept in the bunkhouse, but had moved into the small room off the kitchen that had once served as Henry's office, close enough to provide protection, but respectful of proprieties, until their wedding. "Mama, when are you and Mr. Cade getting married?" Thomas asked, settling at the kitchen table with the directness that characterized his approach to most subjects. "Soon," Eleanor replied, though the question brought a familiar flutter of nervousness. "We're thinking late October, after the harvest is complete." "Good. Jimmy Morrison's been telling everyone at school that you're finally getting remarried, and I want to be able to say it's official," Thomas grinned. "Plus, I like the idea of having a pa again." Eleanor's heart clenched at her son's casual reference to Cade as a father figure. Both boys had begun referring to him as Pa Cade in private conversations, though they still used Mr. Cade in his presence out of ingrained respect. "Thomas, you understand that Mr. Cade can never replace your father, don't you? Papa will always be your papa, even though he's gone." "I know, Mama, but a boy can have more than one pa, can't he? Papa Henry gave us life and love and memories. Pa Cade is giving us guidance and protection and teaching us to be men." Thomas's young face was serious with thought. "It seems to me like we're lucky to have had both." Eleanor marveled once again at her son's wisdom. The ability to love Cade without feeling disloyal to Henry's memory had been something she'd struggled with. But her children seemed to understand instinctively that love wasn't finite, that there was room in their hearts for both the father they'd lost and the stepfather they were gaining. The sound of approaching riders interrupted her thoughts, and Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that accompanied unexpected visitors. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback, but these weren't the threatening figures she'd learned to fear. Instead, she recognized Pastor Williams from the Prairie Gulch Community Church, along with Dr. Harrison and Samuel Mitchell, who owned the Mercantile. "Company," Thomas observed, already moving toward the door with the protective instincts that had developed since the troubles began. "Should I get Mr. Cade?" "Let's see what they want first," Eleanor said, though she noticed that Cade and Michael had already stopped their work and were watching the approaching visitors with alert attention. Eleanor stepped onto the front porch as the 3 men dismounted, arranging her features in a welcoming expression despite the anxiety fluttering in her chest. Unexpected visits from community leaders usually meant either very good news or very bad news, and given recent events, she wasn't optimistic. "Mrs. Wade," Pastor Williams called, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "I hope we're not interrupting your day too severely. We have some matters we'd like to discuss with you and Mr. Mercer, if you're both available." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though her pulse quickened. "Thomas, please ask Mr. Cade and Michael to join us." As her son ran to fetch the men, Eleanor studied the faces of her visitors, trying to gauge their intentions. Pastor Williams wore his usual expression of gentle concern, but there was something more serious than usual in his demeanor. Dr. Harrison looked uncomfortable, his weathered features set in lines of worry. Samuel Mitchell, normally jovial and talkative, seemed unusually subdued. Cade and Michael approached with the measured caution that had become second nature, and Eleanor noticed how Cade positioned himself slightly in front of her family, not obviously protective, but clearly ready to step between them and any threat. "Gentlemen," Cade said with a polite nod, "what brings you out to the Wade Ranch today?" Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, we've come to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your background and about the impact your presence here might have on our community." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. This was what they'd been dreading, the moment when Cade's past would be used against them. "What kind of concerns?" Eleanor asked, moving to stand beside Cade in a gesture of solidarity. Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, we've received information suggesting that Mr. Mercer has a history of violence, serious violence. There are those in the community who feel that such a man might not be the appropriate choice for a husband and stepfather. And there are those," Samuel Mitchell added with obvious reluctance, "who worry that his presence here might attract the kind of trouble our peaceful community prefers to avoid." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest. And just who provided this information about Mr. Mercer's background? The 3 men exchanged glances, and Eleanor knew before Pastor Williams spoke that her suspicions were correct. "The source of the information isn't as important as the information itself, Mrs. Wade. We're told that Mr. Mercer was known throughout Arizona territory as a gunfighter of considerable reputation, that he's killed men, multiple men, in fair fights," Cade said quietly, his voice carrying no defensiveness, only weary resignation. "And only men who forced the confrontation. But yes, I've killed men. I won't lie about that." Michael stepped closer to Cade, his young face set with fierce loyalty. "Mr. Cade has never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. He's the most honorable man I've ever met. I'm sure he seems that way to you, son," Dr. Harrison said gently, "but reputation has a way of following a man, especially when that reputation involves violence. There could be consequences for your family. There could be," Cade agreed, and Eleanor heard the pain in his voice. "Which is why I've offered to leave, to find somewhere else to make a new start. Mrs. Wade has refused to consider it." Eleanor stepped forward, her chin raised with determination. "Because Mr. Mercer has proven himself to be exactly the kind of man this family needs. A man of integrity, patience and courage. a man who judges others by their character rather than their past mistakes. Mrs. Wade, Pastor Williams said gently, we understand your attachment to Mr. Mercer, but surely you must consider the welfare of your sons. What kind of life will they have if they're known as the stepsons of a notorious gunfighter? They'll have the life of young men raised by parents who love them and teach them the difference between right and wrong. Eleanor replied firmly, Mr. Mercer's past doesn't define him any more than my widowhood defines me. Samuel Mitchell looked genuinely distressed. Eleanor, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to protect you and the boys from making a mistake that could have lasting consequences. The only mistake I could make would be to let fear and gossip drive away the best man I've ever known, Eleanor said, reaching for Cade's hand. Mr. Mercer has been nothing but honorable in his dealings with my family and with everyone in this community. That may be true, Dr. Harrison acknowledged, but honor doesn't stop bullets, Eleanor. If men come looking for the ghost of Tombstone, then they'll find a family prepared to defend itself, and a community that stands together. Eleanor interrupted. Unless, of course, the community has decided that protecting its own is less important than avoiding uncomfortable truths. The three men looked deeply uncomfortable at Eleanor's challenge. Finally, Pastor Williams spoke with obvious reluctance. There's been talk, Mrs. Wade, talk of asking Mr. Mercer to move on for the good of everyone involved. Some of the church board members feel that a man with his history shouldn't be welcomed into our congregation, especially not in such a prominent role as your husband. Eleanor felt something hot and fierce rise in her chest. And what does the Bible say about redemption, Pastor Williams? About forgiveness and second chances? About judging men by the content of their character rather than the sins of their past? Pastor Williams flushed. Of course, the Bible speaks of redemption, but you're more concerned with what people will think than with what God commands. Eleanor finished, her voice sharp with disappointment. I'm surprised at you, Pastor. I thought you were a man of greater faith. Now see here, Eleanor, Samuel Mitchell began, but Cade held up a hand. Gentlemen, Mrs. Wade has every right to be angry on my behalf, but there's no need for this conversation to damage relationships that have been built over years. Cade's voice was calm, reasonable. You've expressed your concerns, and I understand them. Let me ask you this, what would it take for you to judge me by my actions since arriving in Prairie Gulch, rather than by stories about my past? The three men exchanged glances again, clearly not having expected this approach. I suppose, Pastor Williams said slowly, it would depend on your willingness to renounce your former life publicly, to demonstrate your commitment to peace and Christian values, and on whether you can truly protect this community from the consequences of your past, Dr. Harrison added. Cade nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. Pastor Williams, I've already renounced my former life by my actions. I haven't worn guns since arriving here. I've resolved conflicts through discussion rather than violence, and I've done everything possible to be a contributing member of this community. If you need me to do so publicly, I'm willing. He turned to Dr. Harrison. As for protection, I can't promise that my past will never catch up with me, but I can promise that if it does, I'll face whatever comes in a way that minimizes danger to innocent people. And I can promise that until that day comes, if it ever does, I'll use every skill I possess to help protect this community from threats like Jeremiah Blackwood. Eleanor felt a surge of pride at Cade's dignified response to what amounted to community rejection. He was offering them exactly what they claimed to want, public redemption and protective capability, while maintaining his integrity and refusing to be driven away by fear. You mentioned Blackwood, Samuel Mitchell said, his attention sharpening. What do you know about his activities? I know that he's been systematically pressuring smaller ranchers to sell their properties below market value, and that those who refuse have experienced mysterious accidents and equipment failures. Cade replied, I know that he's been asking questions about me, looking for leverage to use against Mrs. Wade. And I know that the kind of men he employs don't limit themselves to legal intimidation when illegal methods might be more effective." Dr. Harrison frowned. "Are you saying Blackwood is behind the recent problems several of our ranchers have experienced?" "I'm saying that the pattern of incidents is too convenient to be coincidental. And I'm saying that a community that stands together against bullies is much safer than one that allows itself to be divided by fear and suspicion." The three men considered this, and Eleanor could see the wheels turning in their minds as they weighed the threat from Blackwood against their concerns about Cade's past. "What are you proposing, Mr. Mercer?" Pastor Williams asked finally. "I'm proposing that you judge me by my actions over the next month. Give me a chance to prove that I'm the man I claim to be now, not the man I used to be. And in return, I'll help organize the Mutual Defense Association that several ranchers have been discussing. We can protect each other against real threats instead of fighting imaginary ones." Eleanor watched the three men exchange glances, seeing calculation and cautious hope in their expressions. Finally, Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "1 month, Mr. Mercer, but understand that there are conditions. Any sign of your old life causing problems for this community, any indication that you're not the reformed man you claim to be, and we'll expect you to honor your earlier offer to leave." "Understood," Cade replied without hesitation. After the men left, Eleanor found herself alone with Cade in the kitchen, while the boys returned to their chores. The weight of the confrontation settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. "Are you sorry?" she asked quietly. "Sorry you ever came here, ever got involved with us?" Cade turned to her with surprise. "Eleanor Wade, marrying you and being a father to those boys will be the greatest privilege of my life. I'd face down 100 suspicious church boards for the chance to spend my life with you." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "Even if it means you can never truly escape your past." "My past made me who I am," Cade said, pulling her into his arms. "It taught me to value peace, to recognize real danger when I see it, and to understand the difference between reputation and character. I wouldn't change the experiences that brought me to you." Eleanor buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar sense of leather and honest work that had become synonymous with safety and love. "I love you, Cade Mercer," she whispered, "past, present, and future. And I love you, Eleanor Wade, more than my own life." Outside, the sound of Michael's spurs jingled as he walked past the kitchen window, and Eleanor smiled through her tears. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family, and that, she thought, was worth fighting for. Eleanor was cleaning out Henry's desk 3 days later when she found the wanted poster, yellowed with age and folded small enough to hide behind a stack of property deeds. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper, revealing a younger version of Cade's face above the words that would change everything. "Wanted for murder, the ghost of Tombstone, 500 reward." But it wasn't Cade's picture that made Eleanor's blood turn to ice. It was the smaller print beneath the description of his crimes, including the death of a corrupt rancher and suspected cattle rustler named Henry Wade, gunned down in Tombstone in the summer of 1878. Eleanor sank into Henry's chair, the poster fluttering from nerveless fingers. The room spun around her as the impossible truth crystallized. The man she loved, the man she'd agreed to marry, had killed her first husband. "Mama?" Thomas's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the terrible irony of her son's words. She had seen a ghost. The ghost of the man who'd destroyed her family years before she'd even known of his existence. "Thomas," she managed finally, her voice sounding strange and hollow, "please go find Michael and ask him to come to the house. And tell Mr. Cade." She stopped, unable to say his name. "Tell him I need to speak with him. Immediately." Thomas's young face creased with worry. "Mama, what's wrong? You're scaring me." Eleanor forced herself to focus on her son's concerned features, pushing down the hysteria that threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm all right, sweetheart. Just go get your brother and Mr. Cade, please. After Thomas left, Eleanor picked up the wanted poster with shaking hands, studying every detail with the desperate hope that she'd misunderstood, that there was some explanation that would make sense of the impossible. But there was no mistake. The description was too specific, the details too precise. Henry Wade, beloved husband and father, honest rancher and pillar of the community, had been shot down in Tombstone by the man who now slept under their roof and played father to Henry's sons. Eleanor's mind reeled as memories cascaded through her consciousness, taking on sinister new meanings. Henry's mysterious trip to Arizona Territory just months before his death. The one he'd claimed was about buying cattle, but had been strangely secretive about his distraction and worry upon returning, the way he'd seemed haunted by something he couldn't or wouldn't share. The sudden onset of his illness, the rapid decline that doctors had attributed to consumption, but had never quite made medical sense. Had Henry been fleeing something when he returned to Prairie Gulch? Had the stress and fear contributed to his death? Had Cade's bullet been the first blow in a sequence that had ultimately orphaned her sons? The sound of boots on the front porch made Eleanor's heart hammer against her ribs. She folded the poster carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, then rose to face the man she'd thought she knew. Cade entered with Michael and Thomas behind him, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp concern as he took in Eleanor's pale, shaken appearance. "Eleanor," Thomas said, "you needed to see me urgently. What's happened?" Eleanor looked at her sons, Henry's sons, standing trustingly beside the man who had killed their father, and felt something break inside her chest. How was she supposed to tell them? How was she supposed to destroy their newfound happiness with a truth so brutal it would shatter their world? "Boys," she said quietly, "I need to speak with Mr. Cade privately. Please go to your rooms." "But Mama," Thomas began. "Please," Eleanor repeated, and something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because both boys left without further protest, though their worried glances made it clear they would be listening from the top of the stairs. When they were alone, Eleanor faced Cade across the kitchen that had become their sanctuary, the space where they'd shared dreams and plans and declarations of love. Now, it felt like a battleground. "There's something you need to see," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She withdrew the wanted poster from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. Cade's face went white as he recognized the document. His blue eyes, which had gazed at her with such love and warmth just that morning, now reflected nothing but guilt and anguish. "Eleanor," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did you kill my husband?" Cade's silence was answer enough, but after a long moment, he nodded. Yes. The simple word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Despite the evidence, despite her logical certainty, she'd somehow hoped he would deny it, would provide some explanation that would restore her faith in him. "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Cade moved slowly to the chair across from her, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he feared that any sudden motion might cause her to flee. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with pain and regret. "Because I believed he was a criminal, because I was told he was stealing cattle, cheating honest ranchers, using his position and reputation to cover up crimes that were ruining good people's lives." Eleanor stared at him. "That's impossible. Henry was the most honest man I've ever known. He would never—" "I know that now," Cade interrupted softly. "I've lived in his house, slept in his bed, seen the man he was, through the family he left behind. I've seen the respect people have for his memory, the love his sons carry for him, the kind of woman who mourned him so faithfully. Henry Wade was a good man, Eleanor, and I killed him based on lies." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Then why? Why would someone lie about him? Why would anyone want him dead? Cade's expression grew grim. Because Henry Wade owned land that someone else wanted. Because he had a reputation for integrity that made him dangerous to men who operated outside the law. Because killing him and destroying his reputation would serve multiple purposes for the right kind of enemy. Blackwood, Eleanor breathed, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Cade nodded. It took me years to piece together the truth, years to understand that I'd been played for a fool, used as a weapon by a man who was too much of a coward to do his own killing. By the time I realized what had really happened, it was too late to make amends to the man I'd wronged. Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. You knew. When you came here, you knew who I was, who the boys were. You knew you'd killed their father. Yes. The word was stark, uncompromising. And you thought what? That you could make up for murdering Henry by seducing his widow and playing father to his children? Eleanor's voice rose with fury and pain. Did you think that would balance the scales somehow? No. Cade's voice was quiet but firm. I thought I could find a way to protect the family I'd unknowingly destroyed. I thought I could honor Henry's memory by being the kind of man he would have been, by giving his sons the guidance he couldn't provide, by loving his wife the way she deserved to be loved. By lying to us. Eleanor stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. Every day, every kiss, every moment of tenderness was built on the lie of who you really are. I never lied about who I am now, Eleanor. I never lied about loving you, about caring for the boys, about wanting to spend my life making up for the mistakes of my past. Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter pain. Making up for mistakes? Henry is dead, Cade. Dead because of you. There is no making up for that. There's no redemption that can bring back a father to his sons, a husband to his wife. I know that, Cade said, and Eleanor could see tears in his blue eyes. Don't you think I know that? Don't you think I've lived with that knowledge every single day since I learned the truth? Coming here, falling in love with you and the boys, has been both the greatest joy and the greatest torment of my life. Eleanor stared at him, seeing the man she loved and the man she now had to hate existing in the same body, occupying the same space. Get out, Eleanor. Get out of my house. Get off my land. I don't ever want to see you again. Cade rose slowly, his face etched with grief. What will you tell the boys? The question hit Eleanor like another blow. What could she tell them? That the man they'd come to love and trust, the father figure they'd welcomed into their hearts, had destroyed their real father? That their happiness had been built on the gravestone of the man they still mourned? I don't know, she whispered. I don't know how to tell them that the man they've learned to love killed the man they've never stopped missing. Cade took a step toward her, then stopped as Eleanor backed away from him. Eleanor, please. The boys need guidance, protection. Blackwood's threats haven't gone away just because... Don't you dare use my son's safety to justify staying here. Eleanor snapped. Don't you dare pretend you care about protecting them when you're the one who made them orphans in the first place. Cade's face went white. That's not fair, and you know it. What I did to Henry was wrong, but it doesn't change what I feel for Michael and Thomas. It doesn't change the fact that I'd die before I let anything happen to them. You already let something happen to them, Eleanor said coldly. You let their father die. The words hung in the air between them like a judgment, and Eleanor watched Cade absorb the blow with the stoicism of a man who had been expecting it. You're right, he said finally. And you're right to send me away. I never should have come here. I never should have believed I could find peace by inserting myself into the lives of the people I'd hurt most. He moved toward the door, then paused. Eleanor, I need you to know something. Every feeling I've had for you, every moment of love and tenderness has been genuine. Coming here didn't start as an attempt to make amends. It started as a man looking for work who recognized a name from his past. But staying, loving you and the boys, wanting to build a life here that was real. That was the most real thing I've ever felt. Eleanor turned away from him, unable to bear the pain in his voice. It doesn't matter. None of it matters now. It does matter. Because Blackwood knows the truth about Henry's death, and he knows I'm here. That's why he's been pressuring you so hard, why he's been asking questions about me. He orchestrated Henry's death once, Eleanor. If I leave now, if you're left unprotected, he'll find another way to get what he wants." Eleanor spun to face him, fury blazing in her eyes. "So now you're threatening me, telling me I need you to survive? I'm telling you the truth about the danger you're in. I'm telling you that my leaving might make you feel better, but it won't make you safer." "I'll take my chances," Eleanor said, through gritted teeth. "I'd rather die than accept protection from the man who murdered my husband." Cade's shoulders sagged with defeat. "Then there's nothing more to say." He moved toward the door again, then stopped once more. "Eleanor, when you tell the boys, and you'll have to tell them eventually, please help them understand that my feelings for them were never false. They deserve to know that someone saw them as worthy of love and guidance, even if that someone was unworthy of giving it." "Don't tell me what my sons deserve," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "Just go, please, just go." After Cade left, Eleanor sank into her chair and sobbed with a depth of grief she hadn't experienced since Henry's funeral. But this time, she wasn't just mourning a loss, she was mourning a betrayal, a deception so profound it made her question everything she thought she knew about love and trust and human nature. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her wipe her eyes and try to compose herself, but she knew her sons had heard everything. Their faces appeared in the kitchen doorway, Michael's features set with premature seriousness, while Thomas looked confused and frightened. "Mama," Michael said quietly, "is it true? Did Mr. Cade really kill Papa?" Eleanor looked at her sons, Henry's sons, and felt her heart break all over again. "Yes, sweetheart, it's true." Thomas's face crumpled. "But he loves us, Mama. He teaches us things and makes us laugh and—" "I know, baby, I know." Eleanor pulled both boys into her arms, holding them as they struggled to understand how the man they'd come to love could be the same person who had destroyed their family. "Why?" Michael asked, his voice thick with tears. "Why would he come here if he knew what he'd done?" Eleanor wished she had an answer that would make sense to a 14-year-old, but the truth was she didn't understand it herself. "I don't know, Michael. I honestly don't know." They held each other in the gathering darkness, three people trying to make sense of a betrayal so complete it seemed to rewrite their entire understanding of the world. Outside, Eleanor could hear the sounds of Cade gathering his belongings from the bunkhouse, preparing to leave the life they'd all believed they were building together. As the sound of hooves faded into the distance, Eleanor realized that Cade's departure left them not just heartbroken, but truly alone for the first time since his arrival. The protection he'd provided, the sense of security his presence had brought, the help with ranch work that had become essential to their operation, all of it was gone. And somewhere out there, Jeremiah Blackwood was waiting for exactly this moment of vulnerability. Eleanor held her sons tighter and tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. Tonight, it was enough to grieve for the man they'd all loved and lost twice, once to death and once to the terrible truth about the man who'd claimed to want to honor his memory. But even as she mourned, Eleanor couldn't shake Cade's final warning. If he was right about Blackwood's involvement in Henry's death, if the cattle baron had orchestrated her husband's murder and was now waiting for the perfect moment to claim what he'd killed for, then her family was in more danger than ever. The irony was bitter and complete. The man who'd destroyed her family might be the only one capable of saving what remained of it. But that was a choice Eleanor couldn't make, a betrayal she couldn't forgive, not even to protect her children. As she tucked her sons into bed and tried to answer their impossible questions, Eleanor Wade faced the hardest truth of all. Sometimes, love wasn't enough. Sometimes the wounds were too deep, the betrayals too complete, for forgiveness to bridge the gap between who someone was and who they'd pretended to be. But as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about the pain in Cade's eyes, the genuine anguish in his voice when he spoke of Henry's death. Could a man fake that kind of regret? Could someone who was truly evil love her sons with such obvious devotion? The questions tormented her through the long, sleepless night, but they couldn't change the fundamental truth. Cade Mercer had killed Henry Wade. Everything else, every kiss, every tender moment, every promise of future happiness was just aftermath. And Eleanor Wade was alone again, facing an uncertain future, with only her grief and her determination to protect what remained of her family. It would have to be enough, because it was all she had left. Eleanor discovered Henry's hidden ledger 2 days after Cade's departure, tucked behind loose boards in the barn wall, where her husband had apparently concealed it before his final fatal trip to Arizona territory. The leather-bound book contained entries in Henry's careful handwriting that painted a picture of the husband she'd thought she knew and revealed truths that turned her understanding of everything upside down once again. She sat in the barn's dusty light, the ledger open on her lap, reading entry after entry that detailed Henry's involvement in a cattle-rustling operation that stretched across 3 territories. Not as a victim, as she'd always believed, but as a willing participant who had used his reputation for honesty to provide cover for criminals while taking a substantial cut of their profits. Delivered 50 head to Miller's Canyon as agreed. Read one entry from early 1878. Payment received 500. Much easier than honest ranching, and the risk is minimal as long as we're careful about which herds we target. Another entry, dated just weeks before Henry's death. Blackwood growing suspicious about our operations. May need to consider other arrangements or find way to eliminate his concerns permanently. Eleanor's hands shook as she turned the pages, each entry more damning than the last. Her husband, the man she'd mourned as a paragon of virtue, the father she'd held up as an example to their sons, had been a criminal. Not just any criminal, but one who had used his standing in the community to facilitate crimes that hurt innocent people. The final entries painted an even darker picture. Henry had discovered that Jeremiah Blackwood was planning to expose the rustling operation to territorial authorities, and he had been making plans to eliminate the threat. Plans that involved ambushing Blackwood and making it look like an accident. But someone else had been faster. Someone had gotten to Henry first, in a confrontation that the ledger revealed had been Henry's own fault, a meeting he'd arranged to threaten Blackwood's representative, not knowing that representative was a legendary gunfighter who wouldn't be intimidated by a corrupt rancher with delusions of power. Eleanor closed the ledger and sat in the dusty silence of the barn, her mind reeling as everything she'd believed about her life rearranged itself around these new revelations. Henry hadn't been the victim of a random killing or a case of mistaken identity. He'd been a criminal who had died in the process of trying to murder someone else, someone who had fought back in self-defense. Cade had killed Henry Wade, yes. But Henry Wade had been trying to kill Cade first. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts, and Eleanor looked out through the barn doors to see Jeremiah Blackwood riding up with 6 armed men behind him. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the timing 2 days after Cade's departure, just long enough to be certain he wasn't coming back. Eleanor slipped the ledger inside her jacket and walked out to meet them, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Michael and Thomas were in the house, hopefully staying away from the windows, as Cade had taught them. "Mrs. Wade," Blackwood called as he dismounted, his pale eyes glittering with satisfaction. "How lovely to see you again. I trust you've had time to reconsider my generous offer." "Nothing has changed, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor replied, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "The ranch isn't for sale." Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. "Oh, but I think quite a lot has changed. Word around town is that your hired gun has abandoned you. Left you quite suddenly, I'm told, after some sort of domestic difficulty." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course, the whole town was talking about Cade's abrupt departure. In a community the size of Prairie Gulch, nothing remained secret for long. "My personal affairs are none of your concern," she said as steadily as she could manage. "When they affect the security of this valley, they become everyone's concern," Blackwood replied, moving closer with the casual confidence of a predator closing in on wounded prey. "A woman alone with 2 children, trying to operate a ranch of this size, is a danger to herself and her neighbors. Accidents happen so easily when people are overwhelmed by responsibilities they can't handle. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor glanced at the men behind Blackwood, noting the way they sat their horses with the easy alertness of professionals. These weren't cowboys, they were gunfighters, hired killers brought in to finish what intimidation couldn't accomplish. "What do you want, Mr. Blackwood?" Eleanor asked directly. "I want to prevent tragedy, my dear Eleanor. I want to make sure that you and your boys don't suffer unnecessarily when the inevitable occurs." Blackwood's voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone of a man discussing business arrangements rather than threats. "I'm prepared to offer you 75% of the ranch's assessed value, paid immediately, with provision for you to remain in the house until you can make other arrangements. Quite generous, really, considering your circumstances." Eleanor looked at the 6 gunmen, at Blackwood's confident expression, at the isolation of her ranch and the long distance to town. Without Cade's protection, without any hope of help arriving in time to matter, she and her sons were completely vulnerable. But she thought about Henry's ledger, about the crimes her husband had committed, and the lies she'd built her life around. She thought about Cade's genuine love for her sons, his patient guidance and protective instincts. She thought about the pain in his eyes when he'd spoken of Henry's death, and his desperate desire to make amends for a mistake that had cost an innocent family their father. Except Henry hadn't been innocent, and the family had been Cade's victims, only in the sense that they'd been lied to about who their husband and father really was. "I need time to consider your offer," Eleanor said finally, her mind racing as she tried to buy time to think, to plan, to find some way out of the trap that was closing around them. "Of course," Blackwood agreed readily. "Shall we say 3 days? That should give you ample time to discuss the matter with your sons and make the practical arrangements." 3 days, Eleanor agreed, though she knew it wouldn't make any difference. In 3 days, she would still be alone and outgunned, still faced with the choice between surrender and destruction. After Blackwood and his men left, Eleanor returned to the house to find Michael and Thomas waiting for her in the kitchen, their faces pale with worry. "Mama, we heard everything," Michael said quietly. "He's going to take the ranch, isn't he?" Eleanor sank into a chair, suddenly feeling every year of her age and every burden she carried. "I don't know, sweetheart. I honestly don't know what we're going to do. We could send word to Mr. Cade," Thomas suggested hopefully. "He'd come back if he knew we were in danger." Eleanor's heart clenched. "Thomas, Mr. Cade killed your father. We can't just forget that because we need his help." "But Mama," Michael said carefully, "what if Papa wasn't the man we thought he was? What if Mr. Cade had reasons we don't understand?" Eleanor stared at her elder son, seeing wisdom in his young eyes that shouldn't have existed at 14. "What makes you say that?" Michael and Thomas exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. "We found some things in Papa's room," Thomas admitted reluctantly. "Papers and letters hidden under a loose floorboard. We weren't snooping, Mama. Honest. We were just looking for something of his to keep, something special." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "What kind of papers?" Michael disappeared upstairs and returned with a small bundle of documents tied with string. Eleanor recognized Henry's handwriting immediately, but these weren't the love letters or family documents she might have expected. They were business correspondence, arrangements for cattle purchases that didn't match the ranch's records, agreements with men whose names she didn't recognize. "We didn't understand most of it," Michael said quietly. "But some of the letters mentioned money Papa was supposed to get for helping with things that didn't sound like regular ranch business." Eleanor added these documents to the ledger in her jacket, feeling the weight of evidence that painted an increasingly clear picture of her late husband's double life. "Boys," she said carefully, "if you learned that Papa had done things wrong, would that change how you felt about him?" Thomas considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "I guess it would make me sad, but he'd still be our Papa. People make mistakes, don't they? Even good people sometimes make bad choices." And if you learned that Mr. Cade had reasons for what he did, good reasons, even if the result was terrible, would that change how you felt about him? Michael's answer came without hesitation. It would mean we need to understand the whole story before we decide who's good and who's bad. Eleanor looked at her sons, marveling at their capacity for forgiveness and their instinctive understanding that the world was more complicated than simple divisions between heroes and villains. "There's something I need to show you," she said finally, and retrieved Henry's ledger from her jacket. For the next hour, Eleanor walked her sons through the evidence of their father's criminal activities, helping them understand the complex circumstances that had led to his death. She watched their faces as they processed the information, seeing confusion and disappointment, but also a growing understanding of the moral complexities involved. "So Mr. Cade didn't murder Papa," Thomas said finally. "He defended himself against Papa's attack. And Papa was planning to hurt Mr. Blackwood first," Michael added, his young face troubled. "That means Mr. Cade stopped Papa from becoming a murderer." Eleanor nodded slowly. "It appears that way, yes." The two boys were quiet for a moment, absorbing this new understanding of their family's history. "Mama," Michael said finally, "we think you should ask Mr. Cade to come back." "Boys, not because we need his protection," Thomas interrupted, though his expression suggested he was well aware of their vulnerability, "but because he loves us, and we love him, and love shouldn't be punished for someone else's mistakes." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Her sons, barely past childhood, had grasped truths about forgiveness and justice that she was still struggling to accept. "Even if I wanted to ask him to return," she said gently, "I don't know where he went or how to find him." "Sheriff Morrison might know," Michael suggested, "or Pastor Williams. Men like Mr. Cade don't just disappear, they leave word in case someone needs to find them for legal reasons." Eleanor considered this, feeling hope stir in her chest for the first time since finding the wanted poster. Could she swallow her pride, admit her mistake, ask for help from the man she'd banished in her rage and pain? "And what if he won't come?" she asked. "What if he's too hurt by what I said, too angry to forgive me for not trusting him?" "Then we'll face whatever comes together as a family," Michael said with quiet determination. "But at least we'll have tried to do the right thing." Eleanor looked at her remarkable sons, seeing strength and wisdom that reminded her of the best parts of both their fathers, the biological father who had loved them despite his flaws, and the stepfather who had chosen to love them despite the complications. "All right," she said finally. "Tomorrow we'll ride to town and see if we can find a way to reach Mr. Cade. But boys, you need to understand that even if we can find him, he might not be able to get here in time to help with Mr. Blackwood's ultimatum." "That's okay, Mama," Thomas said with the fierce loyalty that had always characterized his approach to family. "At least we'll know we tried to bring him home where he belongs." Eleanor spent that evening writing a letter to Cade, trying to find words that could express her regret, her new understanding, and her desperate need for his help. It was the hardest letter she'd ever written, but also the most important, because she finally understood that sometimes redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about choosing to build something better in the future. As she sealed the envelope, Eleanor found herself praying that it wouldn't be too late, that love could indeed conquer the mistakes and misunderstandings that had driven them apart. Because in just 2 days, Jeremiah Blackwood would return for his answer, and without Cade's protection, she knew exactly what that answer would have to be. The irony was bitter but inescapable. The only man who could save Henry Wade's family was the man who had killed Henry Wade. And Eleanor's only hope was that Cade Mercer still cared enough about that family to forgive her for not understanding the difference between justice and murder, between self-defense and cold-blooded killing. Tomorrow would determine whether love was stronger than pride, whether understanding could overcome betrayal, and whether a family torn apart by secrets and lies could find a way to heal before it was too late to matter. Eleanor's hands trembled as she helped Cade strap on the gun belt he'd sworn never to wear again, the worn leather holsters that had once made him the most feared gunfighter in Arizona territory. He'd arrived just 2 hours before Blackwood's ultimatum was set to expire, riding his black stallion hard through the night after receiving her desperate letter. The reunion had been awkward, painful, and ultimately healing, as Eleanor had poured out her discoveries about Henry's true nature and her understanding of what had really happened in Tombstone. Cade had listened with the stoic patience that characterized his approach to difficult truths, but she'd seen the relief in his blue eyes when she'd asked for his forgiveness and his help. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness of their kitchen, Eleanor was helping the man she loved prepare to become the killer he'd tried to leave behind. And the weight of that responsibility pressed on her heart like a physical pain. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, fastening the second holster around his lean waist. "There has to be another way." Cade's hands covered hers, stilling their nervous movements. "Eleanor, Blackwood brought 6 professional gunmen with him. This isn't a negotiation anymore, it's a war, and the only language men like that understand is violence." Eleanor looked up into his weathered face, seeing the man she loved alongside the legend she'd only heard stories about. "I'm frightened, not of you, but for you. What if I don't survive?" Cade finished gently. "Then at least I'll die protecting the people I love, instead of killing for money or misguided principles. There are worse ways for a man like me to meet his end." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "Don't talk like that. You're coming back to us. Do you hear me? You're coming back because we need you, because the boys need their father, because I need my husband." Cade's smile was soft and full of love. "Yes, ma'am. I intend to come back and marry you proper, raise those boys to be good men, and spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost to misunderstanding." The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze, listening intently to the rhythm of hoofbeats that announced their time was up. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor could see the first hint of sunrise painting the eastern sky, and with it came Jeremiah Blackwood and his hired killers. "Michael, Thomas," Cade called quietly, and the boys appeared from their hiding place behind the pantry door. They'd been awake for hours, too anxious to sleep, and Eleanor could see the fear and determination warring in their young faces. "Listen to me carefully," Cade said, crouching to meet them at eye level. "No matter what happens out there, you stay in this house with your mother. You don't come outside, you don't try to help, and you don't watch from the windows. Do you understand?" Both boys nodded solemnly, though Eleanor could see the effort it cost them to accept passive roles in the defense of their home. "Mr. Cade," Thomas said quietly, "are you going to be all right?" Cade's expression softened as he looked at the boy who had become like a son to him. "I'm going to do everything in my power to come back to you, Thomas. All of you. That's a promise." Michael stepped forward with the gravity that had marked his transition toward manhood. "Sir, we want you to know that we understand now. About Papa, about what really happened, and we want you to know that we're proud to have you as our father." Eleanor watched Cade's composure crack slightly at those words, emotion flickering across his features before he regained control. "Boys, it's been the greatest privilege of my life to be your father, even for such a short time, if I don't make it back." "You will," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "You have to." Cade stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as the sound of horses grew closer. "I love you, Eleanor Wade," he whispered against her hair, "more than my own life." "I love you too, Cade Mercer. Come back to me." With that, he was gone, walking out into the dawn light with the deadly grace that had made him a legend. Eleanor gathered her sons close and positioned them away from the windows, though she couldn't resist peering out to watch the confrontation that would determine their family's fate. Blackwood sat his horse in the center of the yard, his 6 hired guns spread out in a semicircle behind him. The positioning was professional, designed to prevent their target from taking cover or finding an advantageous angle. But as Eleanor watched Cade walk out to meet them, She noticed that he moved with the confidence of a man who had faced worse odds and survived. "Mrs. Wade," Blackwood called toward the house, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I believe our time limit has expired. I trust you've had sufficient opportunity to consider my generous offer." Cade's voice, when he answered, was calm and steady. "Mrs. Wade has decided to decline your offer, Blackwood, permanently." Blackwood's pale eyes fixed on Cade with surprise and calculation. "Well, well, the famous ghost of Tombstone returns from the dead. I wondered if Eleanor might be foolish enough to call you back." "She's not foolish. She's smart enough to recognize a threat when she sees one, and experienced enough to know the difference between a business proposal and extortion." Eleanor could see the tension building between the two men, could feel the violent potential crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Behind Blackwood, his hired guns were shifting in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. "You always were too dramatic for your own good, Mercer," Blackwood said with false casualness. "This is simply a matter of economics. Mrs. Wade has property I need, and I'm prepared to pay fairly for it. If she's unwilling to be reasonable, well, accidents happen to stubborn people. The only accident here is going to be your assumption that 6 guns are better than 1, Cade replied, and Eleanor could hear the dangerous edge that had crept into his voice. "You've made a career of hiding behind other men's violence, Blackwood. Today, that stops." "Does it?" Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. "I count 6 professional gunfighters against 1 aging legend whose reputation may be bigger than his current ability. Those don't seem like favorable odds, even for the ghost of Tombstone." Cade's response was to spread his arms slightly, a gesture that looked casual, but which Eleanor recognized as positioning himself for a fast draw. "Then let's find out how aging affects my abilities, shall we?" The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Eleanor held her breath, her sons pressed close against her sides as 7 armed men faced each other in the growing light of dawn. What happened next occurred so quickly that Eleanor's eyes could barely follow the sequence of events. One of Blackwood's men, a thin, nervous gunfighter on the far left, apparently decided that waiting for a signal was less important than getting the first shot, and his hand dropped toward his pistol. That movement triggered an explosion of violence that shattered the morning stillness. Cade's guns appeared in his hands with supernatural speed, flame and smoke erupting from both barrels as he engaged multiple targets simultaneously. The nervous gunfighter who had started the fight was already falling from his saddle when Cade's left-hand gun swiveled toward the second man, dropping him with a shot that echoed across the valley like thunder. Eleanor had heard stories about gunfighters, about the speed and accuracy that separated legends from ordinary men, but seeing it with her own eyes was something entirely different. Cade moved with fluid precision, every motion economical and purposeful, his guns speaking with deadly authority as he cut down men who were supposed to be professionals. In less than 10 seconds, 4 of Blackwood's 6 hired guns were down, their horses dancing nervously away from their fallen riders. The 2 survivors were struggling to control their mounts while trying to return fire, but their shots went wide as their horses bucked and shied. Blackwood himself had drawn a pistol, but seemed frozen by the sudden reversal of what should have been overwhelming odds. Eleanor watched in fascination and horror as the cattle baron realized that his carefully planned intimidation had become a death trap. "Enough!" Blackwood shouted, raising his hands in surrender. "Enough, Mercer! You've made your point." But Cade wasn't finished. With deadly calm, he shot the 5th gunman from his saddle, then turned his attention to the 6th, who was desperately trying to wheel his horse around for a retreat. "Please!" the man screamed. "I yield! I surrender!" Cade's guns tracked the fleeing rider for a moment, then lowered. "Get out of here," he called, "and spread the word that anyone who rides with Jeremiah Blackwood dies with him." The surviving gunman didn't need to be told twice. He spurred his horse toward the road at a gallop, leaving only Blackwood alive in a yard littered with bodies. Eleanor found herself shaking as she watched the aftermath, amazed by the sudden, decisive end to a threat that had loomed over them for months. In less than a minute, Cade had eliminated 6 armed men and reduced the most powerful cattle baron in the territory to a trembling, defeated figure, begging for his life. But as she watched Cade approach Blackwood's horse, Eleanor realized that the most dangerous part of the confrontation was yet to come, because now, with his hired guns dead and his plans in ruins, Jeremiah Blackwood had nothing left to lose. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she watched Jeremiah Blackwood's trembling hand slowly reach towards something hidden in his coat. Even from her position at the window, she could see the desperate calculation in his pale eyes, the look of a cornered predator with nothing left to lose. Cade stood 15 feet away, his smoking guns still in his hands, but his attention was momentarily focused on checking the bodies of the fallen gunfighters to ensure they posed no further threat. It was exactly the kind of momentary distraction that a desperate man could exploit. "Cade!" Eleanor screamed, her voice carrying across the yard with desperate urgency. "Behind you!" Her warning came just as Blackwood's hand emerged from his coat with a small derringer, the kind of hideout gun that cowardly men carried for insurance. Cade spun at Eleanor's cry, bringing his guns up with fluid grace, but Blackwood was already pulling the trigger. The derringer's sharp crack seemed unnaturally loud after the thunder of the larger guns, and Eleanor watched in horror as Cade staggered backward, red blooming across his white shirt just below his left shoulder. But even wounded, the ghost of Tombstone was faster than a desperate cattle baron with a backup gun. Cade's right-hand Colt spoke with final authority, and Jeremiah Blackwood pitched backward off his horse, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the dawn sky. The derringer fell from his nerveless fingers, its single shot spent on a wound that had failed to stop the most dangerous man in Arizona territory. "Pa!" Thomas shouted, tearing away from Eleanor's restraining hands before she could stop him. The boy burst through the kitchen door and ran toward Cade, who was swaying on his feet, but still upright. "Thomas, no!" Eleanor called, but Michael was already following his younger brother, and she found herself running after both of them into a yard filled with gun smoke and death. She reached Cade just as his knees buckled, catching him as he fell and helping to lower him gently to the ground. Blood seeped through his shirt in an expanding crimson stain, and his face was pale with shock and pain, but his blue eyes were clear and focused on her face. "How bad?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the obvious pain. Eleanor pulled his shirt aside to examine the wound, relief flooding through her as she realized the bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or vital organs. "It's not fatal," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're going to be fine, you stubborn, wonderful man." Michael and Thomas pressed close, their young faces tight with worry, but also bright with fierce pride. "Pa, you did it," Thomas whispered. "You saved us." "We saved each other," Cade corrected gently, reaching up with his good hand to touch the boy's face. "That's what families do." Eleanor looked around the yard at the aftermath of the violence that had finally ended their ordeal. 5 bodies lay scattered in the morning sun, testimony to the deadly skills that Cade had hoped never to use again. But she felt no remorse for the men who had died. They had come here to destroy her family, and they had paid the price for their choice. "What happens now?" Michael asked, and Eleanor heard the practical concern in his voice. At 14, he was already thinking about consequences and explanations, about how the community would react to the gunfight that had settled their problems with such decisive finality. "Now we get Mr. Cade inside and tend to his wound," Eleanor said firmly. "Then we send word to Sheriff Morrison about what happened here. Blackwood brought hired killers to intimidate a widow and her children. No jury in the territory will fault a man for defending his family against those odds." As they helped Cade to his feet, Eleanor noticed something glinting in the morning sunlight near Blackwood's body. She walked over and picked up a simple gold ring, not ornate, but solid and well-made, the kind of ring that would symbolize enduring commitment rather than flashy wealth. "What is it, Mama?" Thomas asked. Eleanor studied the ring, feeling its weight in her palm. It was too small for any of Blackwood's thick fingers, and she realized with a start that it must have belonged to one of the men Cade had shot, perhaps a wedding ring or family heirloom that would never make it back to whoever was waiting for its owner to come home. But as she looked more closely, Eleanor noticed an inscription on the inner band. C.M. My love always. E.W. Her breath caught as she realized what she was holding. This wasn't some stranger's ring. It was an engagement ring that Cade must have commissioned for her, engraved with their initials and hidden in his belongings until the right moment to present it. It must have fallen from his pocket during the gunfight, a symbol of the future they'd almost lost. "Cade," she said softly, holding up the ring for him to see. Even wounded and pale, Cade managed a rueful smile. "Not exactly how I planned to give that to you," he admitted. "I was hoping for a more romantic setting than a yard full of dead gunfighters." Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit. "I can't think of anything more romantic than a man risking his life to protect his family," she said, leaning down to kiss his forehead gently. "This is perfect, Cade. We're perfect." Thomas tugged at her sleeve, his young face still flushed with excitement and residual fear. "Does this mean you're really getting married now? Really truly for always?" "Really truly for always," Eleanor confirmed, helping Cade to his feet with Michael's assistance. "If Mr. Cade is still willing to marry a stubborn widow who took too long to understand what was right in front of her." "Eleanor Wade," Cade said, his voice growing stronger despite his wound. "I'd marry you if you made me wait another 10 years, though I'd prefer not to have to fight any more cattle barons in the meantime." As they made their way toward the house, Eleanor found herself looking back at the scene of devastation one final time. It would take time to clean up the aftermath, to deal with the authorities and the inevitable questions, but the threat that had hung over them for months was finally over. "Mama," Michael said quietly as they reached the porch, "what about Papa Henry? I mean, we understand what really happened now, but how do we remember him? How do we talk about him to other people?" Eleanor paused, considering the question that had been weighing on her mind since discovering the truth about Henry's criminal activities. "We remember that people are complicated, sweetheart. Papa Henry made bad choices, but he also loved us deeply and worked hard to provide for us. Those things can both be true. And we remember that Mr. Cade didn't kill Papa because he was evil," Thomas added, with the straightforward logic that characterized his approach to difficult subjects. "He defended himself against someone who was trying to hurt him. That makes Mr. Cade brave, not bad." Cade paused in the doorway, looking down at the boys, who had become his sons in every way that mattered. "Boys, your father, your first father, was a man who got lost somewhere along the way. Maybe he started out trying to provide for his family and got pulled into things he couldn't control. Maybe he was just weak when he should have been strong, but he loved you, and that love was real, even if his other choices were wrong." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened to Cade speak about Henry with compassion rather than judgment, even after everything that had happened between them. "The important thing," Cade continued, "is that we learn from his mistakes. We choose honesty over easy money. We choose protecting innocent people over protecting ourselves. And we choose to build something good together instead of tearing other people down." Michael nodded solemnly. "So, we can love Papa Henry's memory while also being glad that you stopped him from doing something worse?" "Exactly," Eleanor said, marveling once again at her son's ability to grasp complex moral truths. "We can be sad that he made bad choices while also being grateful that those choices led to Mr. Cade coming into our lives." As they settled Cade in the kitchen and Eleanor began cleaning his wound, Thomas suddenly spoke up with the enthusiasm that had become his hallmark when he had an important idea. "You know what this means?" he announced. "Now we really are a complete family. We've got Mama, and we've got Pa Cade, and we've got each other, and nobody can take that away from us anymore." Eleanor looked around at her family, her wounded fiancé, her remarkable sons, the kitchen where they'd shared so many meals and conversations and dreams, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The violence was over, the threats were ended, and the secrets that had driven them apart were finally resolved. "You're right, Thomas," she said, threading a needle to stitch Cade's wound closed. "We're complete. And anyone who tries to threaten this family in the future will discover exactly why they call your stepfather to be the ghost of Tombstone." Cade winced as she began the stitches, but his smile was bright and genuine. "Actually, I think it's time for the ghost of Tombstone to stay buried permanently. From now on, I'm just Cade Mercer, husband to Eleanor and father to Michael and Thomas. That's all the reputation I need." Eleanor finished the last stitch and bandaged his shoulder with practiced efficiency. "Well, Mr. Mercer, husband-to-be and father to my sons, I think it's time we started planning a wedding. We've wasted enough time on misunderstandings and complications. I want to be your wife as soon as possible." "How soon is soon?" Cade asked, pulling her close with his good arm. Eleanor looked at her sons, seeing their eager faces and understanding that they needed the security of knowing their family was permanent and unshakable. "How about next week? Pastor Williams can perform the ceremony, and we can have the reception right here on the ranch. Simple and honest, the way our life together is going to be." "Next week sounds perfect," Cade agreed, kissing her gently, "though I should probably let this shoulder heal a bit before I try to carry you over the threshold." Thomas rolled his eyes with pre-adolescent exasperation. "Mama doesn't need to be carried anywhere. She's strong enough to walk wherever she wants to go." "That's absolutely right," Eleanor said, laughing at her son's matter-of-fact assessment. "I'll walk into marriage with my eyes wide open and my feet firmly on the ground. But I'll have the strongest, most honorable man in the territory walking beside me." As the morning sun climbed higher, bringing warmth and light to the ranch that had seen too much darkness and uncertainty, Eleanor Wade looked around at her family and felt nothing but gratitude. They had survived loss and betrayal, violence and deception, and emerged stronger and more united than ever. The ring on her finger caught the sunlight, sending sparkles of gold across the kitchen walls like promises of the bright future that lay ahead of them. And for the first time since Henry's death, Eleanor Wade allowed herself to believe that the best days of her life were still to come. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of what was now their shared bedroom, watching Cade teach Thomas the proper way to clean and oil a rifle. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the peaceful domestic scene that had replaced the violence and uncertainty of their past. The family photograph sat on the mantelpiece in a place of honor, their first picture together as the Mercer family, taken on their wedding day by the traveling photographer who had captured their joy and unity for posterity. In the photograph, Eleanor stood between Cade and her sons, all of them dressed in their finest clothes, but unable to hide the genuine happiness that radiated from their faces. The wedding had been everything Eleanor had wanted, simple, honest, and surrounded by friends and family who had come to celebrate their union. Pastor Williams had performed the ceremony with obvious joy, speaking eloquently about second chances and the healing power of love. Even the community members who had initially been skeptical of Cade's past had attended, won over by his consistent demonstration of character and his obvious devotion to Eleanor and the boys. "Remember, son," Cade was saying to Thomas, "a firearm is a tool that demands respect. You never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. You always treat it as if it's loaded, and you never use it in anger or haste." Thomas nodded solemnly, his 12-year-old hands careful and steady as he followed Cade's instructions. The boy had grown taller and more confident in the months since Cade's permanent return, his wild energy channeled into learning skills that would serve him well as he grew to manhood. "When will I be old enough to carry a gun, Pa?" Thomas asked, and Eleanor smiled at the casual use of the title that had become as natural as breathing. "When you can prove to me that you understand the weight of that responsibility," Cade replied seriously. "A man doesn't earn the right to carry weapons by getting older. He earns it by showing judgment, restraint, and respect for life." Eleanor watched the interaction with deep satisfaction, noting how Cade balanced practical instruction with moral guidance. He was raising her sons to be strong without being violent, confident without being arrogant, prepared for danger without seeking it out. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face bright with excitement and a letter clutched in his hand. At 15, he had grown into his height and developing strength, and Eleanor could see glimpses of the impressive man he would become. "Mama, Pa, you need to see this," he said, holding up the letter with obvious pride. "It's from the Territorial Governor's office." Eleanor and Cade exchanged glances, both thinking immediately of potential legal complications from the gunfight that had ended Blackwood's threats. The official inquiry had cleared Cade of any wrongdoing, ruling the deaths justified self-defense in protection of family, but bureaucracy had a way of creating unexpected problems. "What does it say?" Eleanor asked, though Michael's excitement suggested good news rather than trouble. "It's a commendation," Michael announced, his voice cracking slightly with emotion, "for Pa's service to the community in eliminating the Blackwood criminal organization. Apparently, when they investigated his operations after his death, they found evidence of cattle rustling, extortion, and murder going back years." Eleanor felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness as she absorbed this information. Henry's involvement in Blackwood's criminal activities had been just the tip of an iceberg that law enforcement had been unable to see beneath the surface of respectability and political connections. "There's more," Michael continued, his young face glowing with pride. "They're offering Pa a position as territorial marshal with jurisdiction over the entire region. They say they need someone with his skills and reputation to help clean up the remaining criminal elements." Eleanor's breath caught. A territorial marshal position would mean regular travel, dangerous assignments, and constant exposure to the kind of violence Cade had worked so hard to leave behind. It would also mean prestige, official recognition, and the kind of steady income that could secure their family's future permanently. She looked at Cade, trying to read his expression as he processed this unexpected opportunity. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see the conflict in his blue eyes, the part of him that was tempted by the chance to use his skills in service of law and order, warring with his desire for the peaceful domestic life they'd built together. "What do you think?" he asked quietly, his gaze moving between Eleanor and the boys. "It would mean more time away from home, more danger, but also better protection for communities like Prairie Gulch." Eleanor considered the question carefully, weighing their family's needs against the broader implications of Cade's unique abilities. Finally, she smiled and moved to stand beside her husband, taking his hand in hers. "I think," she said slowly, "that the territory would be lucky to have Cade Mercer as marshal, and I think our sons would be proud to have a father who uses his skills to protect innocent people instead of just our family." Thomas looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, his green eyes bright with excitement. "Does that mean you'd get a badge, Pa? A real marshal's badge?" Cade's serious expression softened into a smile. "It would mean a lot of responsibility, son, and it would mean that sometimes I'd have to be away from home for days or weeks at a time. But you'd always come back," Michael said, with the confidence of a young man who had learned to trust in his father's abilities. "And when you were here, you could teach us more about being men of integrity." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened to her sons express their faith in Cade's character and abilities. They had indeed grown into remarkable young men under his guidance, developing the kind of moral certainty that would serve them well throughout their lives. "There's one condition," Eleanor said, looking directly at Cade. If you accept this position, you don't go back to being the ghost of Tombstone. You go as Marshal Cade Mercer, a man of law and order who happens to be very good with guns. The legend stays buried." Cade's smile was warm and genuine. "Yes, ma'am, the ghost died in that yard 6 months ago. What emerged was a better man who understands the difference between killing for money and fighting for justice." As they discussed the details of the marshal position and what it would mean for their family, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. They had survived betrayal and violence, misunderstanding and loss, to emerge as a stronger and more united family than she'd ever thought possible. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, illuminating the photograph on the mantelpiece and casting warm light across the faces of the people Eleanor loved most in the world. Outside, the ranch that had once seemed like a burden too heavy to bear was thriving under Cade's management and the boys' increasingly skilled assistance. That evening, as Eleanor sat on the front porch watching her family work together to repair a section of fence, she thought about the passage from her mother's Bible that had sustained her through the darkest days. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." She had learned, through pain and struggle and ultimate joy, that understanding wasn't always immediate or obvious. Sometimes the people who seemed like enemies were actually saviors. Sometimes the past held secrets that changed everything. And sometimes the greatest love came from the most unexpected places. Cade approached the porch as the sun began to set, his face streaked with honest sweat, and his expression content with the satisfaction of work well done. He settled beside Eleanor on the step, pulling her close with the casual intimacy that had developed between them over months of shared joys and responsibilities. "Any regrets, Mrs. Mercer?" he asked quietly, using the name that still sent a thrill through Eleanor's heart. Eleanor looked out over their land, at their sons working together with easy partnership, at the peaceful prosperity that surrounded them, and felt nothing but gratitude. "Not a single one, Marshal Mercer," she replied, emphasizing his new title with obvious pride. "Though I do have one request." "What's that?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, seeing in his weathered features the man who had saved her family in more ways than she could count. "When you pin on that marshal's badge, remember that your most important job isn't protecting the territory, it's coming home to the people who love you. We need you, Cade. Not the legend, not the gunfighter, but the man who taught my sons to be honorable and showed me what real love looks like." Cade's kiss was gentle and full of promise, and when they broke apart, Eleanor saw her future reflected in his blue eyes, a future full of love and laughter, challenges and triumphs, the kind of partnership that could weather any storm. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Mercer family gathered on the front porch of the ranch that had become their sanctuary. They talked about the future, about Marshal Cade's new responsibilities and the boys' education and the endless possibilities that stretched ahead of them. And Eleanor Wade Mercer, looking around at the faces of the people who had become her whole world, understood at last that sometimes the most beautiful endings were really just the beginning of even better stories. Their tale of love and redemption, of family, forged through trial and strengthened by truth, was just getting started. The photograph on the mantelpiece seemed to smile in the lamplight, capturing forever the moment when 4 separate souls had become one unbreakable family. And in the gentle peace of the Prairie Gulch evening, with the sound of her husband's voice and her son's laughter filling the air, Eleanor knew that every moment of struggle had been worth it for the privilege of loving and being loved by the remarkable men who now called her home.